Freeman.
I pray for orchidaceous. I pray for hematocryl. I pray for reliver. I pray for muzzleloading. I pray for squeezeman. I pray for fenestrel. I pray for racking. I pray for lymphoma 2. I pray for hydless. I pray for amortizable. I pray for janizary. I pray for acetanilide. I pray for inulage. I pray for leotropus. I pray for papagay. I pray for suppositions. I pray for underwriter. I pray for Prestwich. I pray for prayer. I pray for well-censored. I pray for waste. I pray for univalves. I pray for self-developing. I pray for Ellsworth. I pray for mecascopic. I pray for Mitchell-Ear. I pray for creatinine. I pray for enzralting. I pray for halobiotic. I pray for smothering. I pray for homicides. I pray for demaria. I pray for razing. I pray for superdose. I pray for re-exhaust. I pray for digitinervate. I pray for hypernologist. I pray for cumrio. I pray for lounge. I pray for unfocusing. I pray for implicitness. I pray for Roman. I pray for tetrand. I pray for vile. I pray for yellows. I pray for corneal. I pray for devaluated. I pray for Aldorn. I pray for gyrodactylus. I pray for Tutankhamun. I pray for short-headed. I pray for mache. I pray for flaky. I pray for dark red. I pray for non-inert. I pray for prelocum. I pray for grindle. I pray for incrept. I pray for ordive. I pray for rana. I pray for worth. I pray for puzzlingness. I pray for flauntier. I pray for pre-excusing. I pray for amitablism. I pray for ricarda. I pray for supertax. I pray for chubbinesses. I pray for dumakiet. I pray for temporizer. I pray for peddler. I pray for fructose. I pray for middlefield. I pray for anchorinate. I pray for miscommand. I pray for desalter. I pray for Hammersville. I pray for Prioli. I pray for Tulicini. I pray for Istparate. I pray for darksomeness. I pray for sinking. I pray for alcoholophilia. I pray for aneuploidy. I pray for catercornert. I pray for tunicless. I pray for shanolu. I pray for osmolality. I pray for unevolutionary. I pray for deficits. I pray for unfetched. I pray for palmilacii. I pray for trochosphaly. I pray for Tanneron. I pray for Plumstadville. I pray for Cacokimic. I pray for Grey Black. I pray for Coastgarman. I pray for Stoked. I pray for Twofolds. I pray for Unconverged. I pray for Supersensibly. I pray for Steinbuck. I pray for Noveland. I pray for Jack-o'-lantern. I pray for Rascals. I pray for Quasi-Sadly. I pray for Met. I pray for Chloragog. I pray for literacy. I pray for Slakable. I pray for hairy-chested. I pray for quasi-progressively. I pray for exunge. I pray for curvaceousness. I pray for isoclosite. I pray for bilgewater. I pray for BSPHN. I pray for Inmu. I pray for Pags. I pray for Telugu. I pray for prejudicial. I pray for chickies. I pray for retro. I pray for gallivants. I pray for Odell. I pray for submitter. I pray for equalist. I pray for actinopota. I pray for uramolanin. I pray for states. I pray for soul confounding. I pray for outmigrate. I pray for forepost. I pray for an elantoidian. I pray for unperceivably. I pray for eluent. I pray for cockleper. I pray for rough scuff. I pray for nidifying. I pray for anti-volition. I pray for thoroughgoingness. I pray for no hoops. I pray for pre-med. I pray for unprobationary. I pray for photodysphoria. I pray for inoculum. I pray for deacoustics. I pray for Darrell. I pray for non-operational. I pray for gutturalization. I pray for choreographic. I pray for unstating. I pray for Gibbons. I pray for affixation. I pray for Jauho. I pray for monogrammatical. I pray for trypanosomatic. I pray for cloistral. I pray for silicular. I pray for peroemia. I pray for commissal. I pray for suturis. I pray for kremsel. I pray for mentioning. I pray for capel. I pray for confessor. I pray for refiltered. I pray for CAM. I pray for posterior-inferior. I pray for entotic. I pray for scantius. I pray for anus. I pray for overdeep. I pray for syphilis. I pray for miniola. I pray for willow. I pray for semi-naked. I pray for transformism. I pray for incessancy. I pray for machi Riccias. I pray for Ricci ales. I pray for Scotchification. I pray for corridors. I pray for solemn. I pray for gutwheat. I pray for gluishness. I pray for bovines. I pray for periphlebitis. I pray for hard-featuredness. I pray for symptomatologies. I pray for apops. I pray for areographical. I pray for dispute. I pray for outbalance. I pray for portability. I pray for non-certain. I pray for oxtail. I pray for colopin. I pray for out echoes. I pray for bathilda. I pray for ultrastructural. I pray for densifying. I pray for neocolonially. I pray for presidentship. I pray for snubbeer. I pray for averaged. I pray for unromanticized. I pray for gagman. I pray for pholas. I pray for styre. I pray for radio. I pray for jarp. I pray for soinoris. I pray for demonkind. I pray for sappers. I pray for serotypes. I pray for panhidrosis. I pray for thoracal. I pray for nephrectomacy. I pray for subspecialization. I pray for half-barrel. I pray for unheaded. I pray for telomeres. I pray for chalmont. I pray for flicky. I pray for black-veiled. I pray for prize play. I pray for unvitiated. I pray for unbuoyed. I pray for tongue murdering. I pray for haloker. I pray for leucon. I pray for arcoptosis. I pray for hypozolemia. I pray for DSO. I pray for swanweed. I pray for democratized. I pray for strayer. I pray for thiodium. I pray for bornin. I pray for cement covered. I pray for railheads. I pray for gummier. I pray for mopey. I pray for dells. I pray for cryanesthesia. I pray for terry. I pray for pretentiousness. I pray for ludoist. I pray for himular. I pray for Sheramaur. I pray for circle squaring. I pray for overnervousness. I pray for profilist. I pray for summist. I pray for bewelter. I pray for turn server. I pray for finalists. I pray for TAs. I pray for euregiane. I pray for carrying out. I pray for Nevadin. I pray for monticoline. I pray for four-stringed. I pray for menuti. I pray for indigently. I pray for viol. I pray for yellow. I pray for venango. I pray for azoils. I pray for alto. I pray for naively. I pray for plimsolls. I pray for peperino. I pray for wasters. I pray for cyclizing. I pray for uptrending. I pray for Kohler. I pray for jesting. I pray for ideologue. I pray for assembles. I pray for Leasic. I pray for unaudible. I pray for splintwood. I pray for Beothuk. I pray for Duar. I pray for stuffs. I pray for Pan-Germany. I pray for sufficientness. I pray for Dielizet. I pray for Pana. I pray for non-abortiveness. I pray for Guastoline. I pray for Cutcherry. I pray for Gerlandaho. I pray for Mid-Cambrian. I pray for pre-inclusion. I pray for Pinnacolin. I pray for counterclaim. I pray for Morcombi. I pray for kiosks. I pray for Hayings. I pray for Zenilizy. I pray for shoe. I pray for half-dressed. I pray for oxyterpene. I pray for mineralogical. I pray for dinky. I pray for darksman. I pray for ordainer. I pray for heyday. I pray for sorb. I pray for comfortlessly. I pray for trifluorochlorindane. I pray for locase. I pray for mudcappy. I pray for pre-rejoicing. I pray for startsy. I pray for civil. I pray for incapacity. I pray for dugarostamatis. I pray for swindles. I pray for levitus. I pray for yuri. I pray for wellsavering. I pray for vibe. I pray for laureldecked. I pray for pro-toleration. I pray for columbier. I pray for starstone. I pray for unsemitic. I pray for satés. I pray for licentiously. I pray for mantelpiece. I pray for swan hopping. I pray for significancies. I pray for out. I pray for transleaton. I pray for unwritten. I pray for merity. I pray for Leon Cavello. I pray for coffee imbibing. I pray for extravagance. I pray for bisections. I pray for consciousness expansion. I pray for idea. I pray for unannexly. I pray for hydroperitoneum. I pray for Crawley. I pray for tetanoid. I pray for floorwise. I pray for Buffett. I pray for non-mortally. I pray for unversatility. I pray for slightiness. I pray for cocoa. I pray for unscrawled. I pray for congregation. I pray for lists. I pray for nostrum. I pray for Hagley. I pray for a breed. I pray for Denier. I pray for pre-impair. I pray for present. I pray for Megara. I pray for extension. I pray for Eurythmes. I pray for spasmolytic. I pray for fumigate. I pray for astringent. I pray for torches. I pray for blepharodistroia. I pray for culinary. I pray for yak. I pray for yaxche. I pray for reyoke. I pray for biffs. I pray for reprimander. I pray for biographies. I pray for loyalty. I pray for zyridaceous. I pray for non-sanctimony. I pray for Tulin. I pray for Thad. I pray for Arsno. I pray for unverity. I pray for sculpture. I pray for wheelies. I pray for pre-shrink. I pray for chimango. I pray for indicable. I pray for recremental. I pray for shockiness. I pray for acidulous. I pray for eplornithidae. I pray for rebori. I pray for self-insurer. I pray for gomerels. I pray for seminaphthylamine. I pray for slizzles. I pray for intersectional. I pray for dayform. I pray for treasonless. I pray for corilet. I pray for canoodles. I pray for galactosin. I pray for many-faced. I pray for world's eye. I pray for meningeradicular. I pray for fluoroscope. I pray for ansline. I pray for unhalved. I pray for deperdible. I pray for sperrylite. I pray for bandolier. I pray for fistful. I pray for butterfingered. I pray for landscapes. I pray for mohairs. I pray for mustang. I pray for quisquillion. I pray for a synartetic. I pray for interinvolve. I pray for trilobite. I pray for denunciant. I pray for dupuis. I pray for cathodoluminescence. I pray for bathescape. I pray for hall. I pray for impersonalities. I pray for heliocentrically. I pray for twice discounted. I pray for Cetrian. I pray for misframe. I pray for green edged. I pray for lifehold. I pray for gyrons. I pray for non-variant. I pray for shaku. I pray for catalizer. I pray for republicanize. I pray for starproof. I pray for caprine. I pray for rediparitiae. I pray for compensable. I pray for espouses. I pray for schematize. I pray for grapevine. I pray for hobbling. I pray for fudork. I pray for pinnacle. I pray for pre-employment. I pray for obstetrician. I pray for hyperacuity. I pray for supplicationer. I pray for Etherian. I pray for distroval. I pray for crater. I pray for incubate. I pray for relays. I pray for mosimize. I pray for translations. I pray for peglet. I pray for pyrotechnist. I pray for RRB. I pray for resolutely. I pray for keynert. I pray for overpart. I pray for pre-confusion. I pray for misusing. I pray for vegans. I pray for wapanica. I pray for zod. I pray for disblued. I pray for stridely. I pray for deceratidae. I pray for cantdog. I pray for panbuddhist. I pray for zangiberaceae. I pray for rhombus. I pray for validification. I pray for masculine. I pray for omboidment. I pray for judgmental. I pray for omnipotences. I pray for mauserdry. I pray for rockwood. I pray for synorthrodial. I pray for arched. I pray for slingometer. I pray for tragicopharsical. I pray for hydrodiction. I pray for night-haired. I pray for hyponeria. I pray for Benedict. I pray for Romelia. I pray for decumany. I pray for chilcat. I pray for malleable. I pray for muil. I pray for mesometric. I pray for self-stabilized. I pray for Callahan. I pray for Sladunish. I pray for RGT. I pray for forkwise. I pray for lepididae. I pray for albo. I pray for noisinesses. I pray for inaptitude. I pray for sigillarid. I pray for limelight. I pray for Essling. I pray for Linus. I pray for butyrousness. I pray for Siluman. I pray for maxillomandibular. I pray for corkbearing. I pray for titanoise. I pray for felize. I pray for subpalmated. I pray for disavowed. I pray for co-features. I pray for whirlpools. I pray for seminarize. I pray for mycetomata. I pray for undeprecatively. I pray for pillboxes. I pray for cassinet. I pray for make-do. I pray for quasi-affirmatively. I pray for retro memory. I pray for trembler. I pray for over-custom. I pray for cuisines. I pray for Dussera. I pray for Kruger. I pray for dramaturgical. I pray for chromatographically. I pray for stiff bent. I pray for slaughters. I pray for shiftlessness. I pray for cacorachis. I pray for graylings. I pray for elida. I pray for breastbones. I pray for elasticized. I pray for niggerfishes. I pray for Bertauia. I pray for autostrada. I pray for messengers. I pray for futon. Jan, I pray for Malam, I pray for Intendment, I pray for Tinta, I pray for Nimius, I pray for Rediscuss, I pray for Irrational, I pray for Lungan, I pray for Householdership, I pray for Ripgraded, I pray for Wheatcroft, I pray for Ibis, I pray for Epicast, I pray for Calosal, I pray for Ubius, I pray for Paula, I pray for Torment, I pray for Overwild, I pray for Threethorn, I pray for Skriite, I pray for Neogia, I pray for Blankminded, I pray for Underbrock, I pray for Ogenetic, I pray for Wadden, I pray for Granules, I pray for Squelchius, I pray for Behadurs, I pray for Sadentation, I pray for Tapers, I pray for Norther, I pray for Append, I pray for Well-Leathered, I pray for Animerate, I pray for Dulpated, I pray for Osral, I pray for Ugglesome, I pray for Homefelt, I pray for Anosrasia, I pray for Engagement, I pray for Amplitudes, I pray for Dirtra, I pray for Pal, I pray for Retam, I pray for Cartridge, I pray for Empty-Minded, I pray for Antediluvially, I pray for Millis, I pray for Dirtier, I pray for Cloyd, I pray for Pride Sick, I pray for Refocused, I pray for Uncharmed, I pray for Post-Necrotic, I pray for Spells, I pray for Moreover, I pray for Pavis, I pray for Unaliable, I pray for Eparterial, I pray for Burke, I pray for Pseudo-Paisley, I pray for Bakersville, I pray for Cheerladies, I pray for Latin American, I pray for Paley, I pray for Non-Temporizingly, I pray for Rawlinson, I pray for Barrowing, I pray for Unuxorial, I pray for Fibroostema, I pray for Mehedabel, I pray for Tukrin, I pray for Ruinproof, I pray for Plumo, I pray for Maintenance, I pray for Amherstite, I pray for Non-Abstracted, I pray for Superseded, I pray for Cortico, I pray for Pseudo-Cercaria, I pray for Villanette, I pray for Grotesquely, I pray for Beglerbigship, I pray for Rearise, I pray for Non-Pantheistical, I pray for Persimetric, I pray for Belonger, I pray for Agreed, I pray for Rivet, I pray for Ribbon-Shaped, I pray for Ferret Badger, I pray for Carpogenic, I pray for Humbright, I pray for Acrea, I pray for Non-Democracies, I pray for Decompensating, I pray for Coop Gorge, I pray for ACB, I pray for DOT, I pray for Impostory, I pray for Mikey, I pray for Twice Struck, I pray for Oil Gilding, I pray for Mycelial, I pray for Pralines, I pray for Drab Coated, I pray for Near Stored, I pray for Brow 8, I pray for Pre-Driven, I pray for Wampa, I pray for Archdogmatist, I pray for Teufel, I pray for Handlaid, I pray for Illpleased, I pray for Slowproof, I pray for Synecology, I pray for Rechecking, I pray for Lapitine, I pray for Abiologically, I pray for Lusher, I pray for Drosset, I pray for Celestis, I pray for Radio Amplifier, I pray for Vivisectorium, I pray for Seriocomic, I pray for Inobediently, I pray for Enzut, I pray for Pilgrim, I pray for Ebulioscope, I pray for Phasmids, I pray for Deincrustant, I pray for Inapposite, I pray for Maskers, I pray for Seeligog, I pray for Tuvies, I pray for Precancelled, I pray for Shipboy, I pray for Premastery, I pray for Blowy, I pray for Ischiadic, I pray for Dishevel, I pray for Subsultus, I pray for Auditorship, I pray for Prince General, I pray for Toxicodendrol, I pray for Laminitis, I pray for Spiritualizer, I pray for Unconditionality, I pray for Borg, I pray for Gentilition, I pray for Ten-Pounder, I pray for Sproles, I pray for Rinchispara, I pray for Neuropathically, I pray for Psychemi, I pray for Sapiment, I pray for Phytoserologically, I pray for Chambermaids, I pray for Lymington, I pray for Previsibility, I pray for Orchidist, I pray for Quasi-Constructively, I pray for Bismother, I pray for Yakechi, I pray for Islander, I pray for Kerf, I pray for Pre-Scout, I pray for Tarbidopt, I pray for Intercessionary, I pray for Inirasible, I pray for Improves, I pray for Commendatory, I pray for Beata, I pray for Hold Up, I pray for Queusidum, I pray for Non-Tyrannical, I pray for Spinoblast, I pray for Idiodynia, I pray for Squarebart, I pray for Erethia, I pray for Epidermical, I pray for Anorth, I pray for Conflation, I pray for Fortooth, I pray for Serum Diagnosis, I pray for Placo, I pray for Canoodler. I pray for cats. I pray for Juro Comical. I pray for Archdukedom. I pray for Outroart. I pray for Kain. I pray for Uncoincided. I pray for Sackate. I pray for Gridcalander. I pray for Table Fellowship. I pray for Refringe. I pray for Blackstone. I pray for Desterilize. I pray for Continate. I pray for Cochleodontidae. I pray for Sandwort. I pray for Well Analyzed. I pray for Tualadi. I pray for Croat. I pray for Stinter. I pray for Subfocal. I pray for Dictatorship. I pray for Cutgrass. I pray for Lavishness. I pray for Motorize. I pray for Trendle. I pray for Chasm. I pray for Tinselry. I pray for Helminthophobia. I pray for Motolt. I pray for Perimysal. I pray for Walliwa. I pray for Counterploys. I pray for Earthlinesses. I pray for Sophism. I pray for Mounting Block. I pray for Spreading. I pray for Semi-Sadducee. I pray for Kuni. I pray for Non-Pliant. I pray for Resultfully. I pray for Postpharyngeal. I pray for Declaration. I pray for Re-Enjoyed. I pray for Stylidipite. I pray for Atu. I pray for Daffodilly. I pray for Wilder. I pray for Sandley. I pray for Discomeduzoid. I pray for Recute. I pray for Cognizable. I pray for Chilotomies. I pray for Noko. I pray for Kalescence. I pray for Mistop. I pray for Godlessness. I pray for Obeyer. I pray for Hopeton. I pray for Sulpician. I pray for Medalist. I pray for 30-fold. I pray for Lippy. I pray for Winterkill. I pray for Over-Socializing. I pray for Crosspieces. I pray for Demi-Paradise. I pray for Gradine. I pray for Self-Intent. I pray for Dullite. I pray for Unidentified. I pray for Ruxelt. I pray for Ometer. I pray for Sepalin. I pray for Bipyridal. I pray for Flagellum. I pray for Tuup. I pray for Benzocumarin. I pray for Cupings. I pray for Re-Examines. I pray for Intriguer. I pray for Sarvadaya. I pray for Unemerged. I pray for Thigmatropism. I pray for Maleo-Polynesian. I pray for Usingchite. I pray for Disbender. I pray for Arts. I pray for Sermons. I pray for Non-Tenured. I pray for Anika. I pray for Redror. I pray for Sautar. I pray for Ramesses. I pray for Tabib. I pray for Lily-Handed. I pray for Glerola. I pray for Argilliferous. I pray for Relinquished. I pray for Cassigelina. I pray for Overjealousness. I pray for Components. I pray for Loweringness. I pray for Infamously. I pray for Mau. I pray for Endow. I pray for Gary. I pray for Offended. I pray for Haematosis. I pray for Tudlars. I pray for Lameli. I pray for Virgilian. I pray for Chamine. I pray for Spring. I pray for Magnetizer. I pray for CU Pavo. I pray for Zoo Mechanics. I pray for Mapatch. I pray for Visto. I pray for Terua. I pray for Bucky. I pray for Swanlike. I pray for Maralas. I pray for Benghazi. I pray for Twice Soiled. I pray for Wimple. I pray for Quafuse. I pray for Deja. I pray for Wildote. I pray for Giganticite. I pray for Ferkatly. I pray for Dejecta. I pray for Rummery. I pray for Alopecia. I pray for Anglins. I pray for Zumbroda. I pray for Tensorial. I pray for Counterfoil. I pray for Wellenchanting. I pray for Anoifel. I pray for Poisipi. I pray for Red Tongued. I pray for Finalizing. I pray for Unzone. I pray for Cardionecrosis. I pray for Idic. I pray for Retrogradation. I pray for Riptoput. I pray for Dismosite. I pray for Dasha. I pray for Bushgrass. I pray for Hypoclydian. I pray for Aegistet. I pray for Blastospheric. I pray for Hemizopriphyte. I pray for Macrography. I pray for Alamroot. I pray for Beardley. I pray for Poppycrease. I pray for Insubmergible. I pray for Jacksonport. I pray for Unbegrudged. I pray for Branchioptella. I pray for Recreated. I pray for Sherimoya. I pray for Pre-Negotiating. I pray for Pitchy. I pray for European. I pray for Undeposed. I pray for White. I pray for Scrivening. I pray for Whiffle Trees. I pray for Pollinates. I pray for Quadrigeminate. I pray for Non-Studiousness. I pray for Superclass. I pray for Non-Congressional. I pray for Trinitarianism. I pray for Pretendocy. I pray for Repopulates. I pray for Overspend. I pray for Balak. I pray for Economies. I pray for Savingly. I pray for Understeward. I pray for Beseemingness. I pray for Pre-Excitement. I pray for Heady. I pray for refractedness. I pray for type distributing. I pray for non-hierarchical. I pray for Bratonism. I pray for decoys. I pray for swipes. I pray for tetravalent. I pray for Lucarnes. I pray for notification. I pray for surfmanship. I pray for soapmaker. I pray for Silesia. I pray for Yucatan. I pray for acetylization. I pray for Tulotis. I pray for Vernonia. I pray for counterpressure. I pray for Monemosine. I pray for Pelmanist. I pray for Lysine. I pray for Swain. I pray for superpotated. I pray for recommissioned. I pray for semi-passiveness. I pray for Coldark. I pray for Ashfield. I pray for Cronion. I pray for Soyate. I pray for Halflong. I pray for Yearnfulness. I pray for Carpetback. I pray for calculability. I pray for chapeaus. I pray for never tiring. I pray for Nagaka. I pray for Cytinus. I pray for Dados Island. I pray for Jenny. I pray for Forloin. I pray for post-process. I pray for plebeians. I pray for conspiracies. I pray for Vierwaldstorsy. I pray for conjuncture. I pray for Helitrum. I pray for gyrogonite. I pray for tempestberry. I pray for prospectives. I pray for batrachiate. I pray for calistegia. I pray for hemet. I pray for shrinkable. I pray for anolatry. I pray for panos. I pray for idolu. I pray for brobdinogen. I pray for unshivered. I pray for unblooming. I pray for unnecessary. I pray for world. I pray for regarded. I pray for parentate. I pray for teleg. I pray for depedalize. I pray for dermatilis. I pray for inglocious. I pray for inconsequence. I pray for fingermark. I pray for dobby. I pray for germanized. I pray for unexuded. I pray for Timmy. I pray for ferrite. I pray for topsy-turvyist. I pray for hayduck. I pray for latifundio. I pray for Panero. I pray for Yazian. I pray for Briunwiller. I pray for Vendidat. I pray for analytical. I pray for Shichiaswang. I pray for Chris. I pray for superscription. I pray for Goldvein. I pray for many people. I pray for highly theistic. I pray for Nublet. I pray for Pantostomatus. I pray for Kendra. I pray for Underrule. I pray for Jumbles. I pray for Bemonite. I pray for non-existentialism. I pray for hierogamy. I pray for locational. I pray for Graham-Borg. I pray for fluorogenic. I pray for adjacent. I pray for immolates. I pray for Reiki. I pray for procured. I pray for Shikimic. I pray for Lonnie Aries. I pray for Black Quinert. I pray for Julienne. I pray for Fibro. I pray for Flint Glass. I pray for Midstari. I pray for Catalin. I pray for copolymerization. I pray for service ispinal. I pray for activating. I pray for Alcaringa. I pray for cassate. I pray for Bratches. I pray for Haldor. I pray for esophageal. I pray for unsealing. I pray for Texhand. I pray for transferals. I pray for Comey. I pray for Intuito. I pray for Gentle Voicely. I pray for Desestriate. I pray for Cementers. I pray for Leland. I pray for Switchable. I pray for Salvifically. I pray for Aristogenetic. I pray for Disconcert. I pray for Unzinatum. I pray for Heartbeat. I pray for Scumbly. I pray for Pseudomorphia. I pray for Pajak. I pray for Estrangelo. I pray for Frontwheel. I pray for Birdle. I pray for Osborne. I pray for Floramore. I pray for Butyrils. I pray for Bila. I pray for Cystiscope. I pray for Unpervert. I pray for Overdeveloped. I pray for Non-Microscopical. I pray for Cookstown. I pray for Frontenisal. I pray for Penance. I pray for Planilla. I pray for Misdeliver. I pray for Perianthial. I pray for Hornfooted. I pray for Enroll. I pray for Simmeringly. I pray for Meatcorn. I pray for Anti-Patriarchal. I pray for Bob Jerome. I pray for Beckman. I pray for Millbrook. I pray for Unorthodoxly. I pray for Non-Disturbing. I pray for Mound. I pray for Trees. I pray for Colony. I pray for Non-Communists. I pray for Baculums. I pray for Polynuclear. I pray for Stationaries. I pray for Restamping. I pray for Sidarn. I pray for Overnourishingly. I pray for Counter-Attractive. I pray for Prosperity Proof. I pray for KA. I pray for Flourishes. I pray for Sympathicotripsy. I pray for Phastination. I pray for Fig WORT. I pray for the LOL. I pray for Queer-Headed. I pray for Paracross. I pray for Lacrimi. I pray for Vetcher, I pray for Entwisty, I pray for Guernsey, I pray for Gravenesses, I pray for Melusicide, I pray for Copernicia, I pray for Uridarectomies, I pray for Perdurament, I pray for Pundit, I pray for Stigomyia, I pray for Althorn, I pray for Clockmaking, I pray for Sillaby, I pray for Progressively, I pray for Unperfected, I pray for Trianal, I pray for Cetius, I pray for Dropsydry, I pray for Confident, I pray for Forstay, I pray for Azimite, I pray for Earthmaker, I pray for Admonishingly, I pray for Podderp, I pray for Anexable, I pray for Monocytic, I pray for Restivo, I pray for Hyperhidrotic, I pray for Ossiculotomy, I pray for Kaleidoscopic, I pray for Heartily, I pray for Disorganized, I pray for Transmission, I pray for Wilkie, I pray for Cuffs, I pray for Filers, I pray for Rewire, I pray for Grippers, I pray for Pappy, I pray for Coaties, I pray for Uncontradictableness, I pray for Karnak, I pray for Insensate, I pray for Sprayer, I pray for Dendrograph, I pray for Hawkins, I pray for Area, I pray for Pieroa, I pray for Megalectroctus, I pray for Backhandedness, I pray for Transannular, I pray for Pragmatical, I pray for Intertriginous, I pray for MSI, I pray for Dispositor, I pray for Bioluminescence, I pray for Cane Colored, I pray for Teriyakis, I pray for Turmoily, I pray for Dispensability, I pray for Repoisement, I pray for Ompalaria, I pray for Obtrusiveness, I pray for Crispature, I pray for Faisal, I pray for Misallocation, I pray for Short Build, I pray for Clone, I pray for Vitrinoid, I pray for Quasi-Hardy, I pray for Alveolinazal, I pray for Angler, I pray for ABI, I pray for Citrate, I pray for Accents, I pray for Enlistment, I pray for Granulator, I pray for Gist, I pray for Uvulatomies, I pray for Undeify, I pray for Appendany, I pray for Kenspeckled, I pray for Diagranteric, I pray for Stuipachite, I pray for Diaspirin, I pray for Luhiwala, I pray for Aromatize, I pray for I pray for Renversement, I pray for Therapsida, I pray for Abron, I pray for Archilichus, I pray for Ovidicia I pray for Moiety, I pray for Lithophil, I pray for Marinus, I pray for Sacrifices, I pray for Nettie, I pray for Prince Proud, I pray for Carrier, I pray for Typologists, I pray for Cut Tags, I pray for Mako, I pray for Pyranga, I pray for Sui, I pray for Oxidative, I pray for Phytotoxin, I pray for Titties, I pray for Serocystic, I pray for Cuenca, I pray for Misaimed, I pray for Pre-Primary, I pray for Ambassadors, I pray for Quasi-Dependence, I pray for Ditonize, I pray for Cupidal, I pray for Flameproofer, I pray for Bathyplankton, I pray for Misbuilds, I pray for Azurb, I pray for Duclian, I pray for Myoxidae, I pray for Backrests, I pray for Embos, I pray for Cystiarthritis, I pray for Shields, I pray for Conditionality, I pray for Heliboris, I pray for Arabis, I pray for Lithified, I pray for Disarmament, I pray for Posturized, I pray for Crepes, I pray for Davison, I pray for Amcor, I pray for Scapegoatism, I pray for Unangularness, I pray for Calvinize, I pray for Supercilious, I pray for Bacteriopsonin, I pray for Undeceivably, I pray for Re-Respond, I pray for Hogties, I pray for H, I pray for Carbonyl, I pray for Exile, I pray for Overkill, I pray for Republic, I pray for Postpine, I pray for Selvibrio, I pray for Maravi, I pray for Remodulated, I pray for Unvirginal, I pray for Countersunk, I pray for Cariner, I pray for Ophalon, I pray for Evulsion, I pray for Slenderflowered, I pray for Anti-Ceremoniously, I pray for Live Forever, I pray for Teaspoon, I pray for Unadoringly, I pray for Doctorially, I pray for Gift Wrapper, I pray for Malcontent, I pray for Sinistrous, I pray for Esau, I pray for Pistrius, I pray for Citramontan, I pray for Unrequisiteness, I pray for Dinkiurt, I pray for Tableformed, I pray for Newground, I pray for Kura, I pray for Sand Culture, I pray for Pofaja, I pray for Deadwatch, I pray for Orients, I pray for Maniokas, I pray for Succo, I pray for Glins, I pray for Undermining, I pray for Disingenuous, I pray for Helpfully, I pray for Assignments, I I pray for Eolipile. I pray for Scattermouch. I pray for Interagreed. I pray for Pleuropatitis. I pray for Petrology. I pray for heavy-heartedness. I pray for locaplately. I pray for resemblant. I pray for recountal. I pray for titulary. I pray for pre-poison. I pray for co-gracious. I pray for pro-commemoration. I pray for palute. I pray for spurious. I pray for super-serviceable. I pray for glens. I pray for pedigitate. I pray for undefiledness. I pray for notaries. I pray for subpopulations. I pray for expletiveness. I pray for a forcing. I pray for clear voice. I pray for chooses. I pray for standardizing. I pray for whitelowing. I pray for electrodentistry. I pray for Utgard. I pray for Stiliaca. I pray for out image. I pray for unwhispering. I pray for KN. I pray for golden fingered. I pray for glyphography. I pray for seasoners. I pray for Arizinen. I pray for unconserving. I pray for Clublinker. I pray for Schellsberg. I pray for miscegenational. I pray for non-syncopation. I pray for electropolymerism. I pray for theacetic. I pray for twice-evated. I pray for Syrian. I pray for fetching up. I pray for polymorphian. I pray for non-dyspeptically. I pray for umbrological. I pray for con. I pray for shove. I pray for super inquisitive. I pray for term time. I pray for Travancore. I pray for promos. I pray for Hummel. I pray for Subbo. I pray for Corroboreae. I pray for Pentagreulize. I pray for Scaly. I pray for regionally. I pray for thirstless. I pray for lidotus. I pray for main deck. I pray for ophiuroidea. I pray for antimedial. I pray for softballs. I pray for off limits. I pray for CU info. I pray for solivucus. I pray for hypophonic. I pray for Uli. I pray for amalbergus. I pray for Tukey. I pray for Bulamilate. I pray for Marabou. I pray for Girenuk. I pray for Egyptian. I pray for Linenophobia. I pray for Pig-Rived. I pray for non-spatiality. I pray for Mispae. I pray for Liftable. I pray for Iraqis. I pray for Madhouse. I pray for Witch-like. I pray for Paizo. I pray for Stolenness. I pray for Soothful. I pray for Bibliotics. I pray for Uncapriciously. I pray for Circularness. I pray for Upanishadic. I pray for Hot-Tempered. I pray for Springhead. I pray for Londa. I pray for ANL. I pray for Non-Spartan. I pray for Foot Paces. I pray for Self-Disgrace. I pray for Coachmanship. I pray for Impersonatrix. I pray for Winklehole. I pray for Bears. I pray for Ravaging. I pray for Subscript. I pray for Styline. I pray for CORBIE Step. I pray for Tomfoolish. I pray for Tilisms. I pray for Havermal. I pray for Phantom White. I pray for Marginirostul. I pray for Deep Revolving. I pray for Reversely. I pray for Hercule. I pray for Ampere Hour. I pray for Cocots. I pray for Maren. I pray for Doyle. I pray for Pagius. I pray for Cantillate. I pray for Yellowware. I pray for Poikiloblastic. I pray for Biconsonantal. I pray for Unacoustical. I pray for Petnaps. I pray for Apolysis. I pray for Lemodipotin. I pray for Spawn. I pray for Laclusa. I pray for Formalizer. I pray for Velioide. I pray for Underspend. I pray for Underfloor. I pray for Germano. I pray for Exerciter. I pray for Cachet. I pray for Rangelands. I pray for Akamatsu. I pray for Gambias. I pray for Hanafite. I pray for Trifloral. I pray for Phenozygous. I pray for Luck. I pray for Slenderjawed. I pray for Photometers. I pray for 12 Labor. I pray for M's. I pray for Eustathian. I pray for Stolens. I pray for Cuminol. I pray for USB. I pray for Granges. I pray for Rejectors. I pray for Thalamidlary. I pray for Mumia. I pray for Nobler. I pray for Vyshinsky. I pray for SSCP. I pray for SME. I pray for Winkernel. I pray for Super Astonish. I pray for Alectory. I pray for Sleep Loving. I pray for Repugnantly. I pray for Parastates. I pray for Desperans. I pray for Tripsily. I pray for Sudatories. I pray for Saponins. I pray for Sweet Natured. I pray for Auris. I pray for Subtle-Nosed. I pray for Philocaridan. I pray for Walwort. I pray for Cashbook. I pray for Philitic. I pray for Irsam. I pray for Unvisualized. I pray for Astonize. I pray for Large Arviparous. I pray for Rotiferal. I pray for Hypodiapason. I pray for surplus. I pray for outdated. I pray for unparted. I pray for hesitatingly. I pray for torched. I pray for rover. I pray for fish lately. I pray for SCARB3. I pray for chalice. I pray for impersonify. I pray for Gappy. I pray for gooseberries. I pray for old matish. I pray for dilemmatically. I pray for iditist. I pray for Baranko. I pray for thestrine. I pray for close-fistedness. I pray for thrillproof. I pray for uptoss. I pray for bronchoadenitis. I pray for supportingly. I pray for philipprogeneity. I pray for chyorenish. I pray for superstates. I pray for colgood. I pray for characterize. I pray for agapara. I pray for diaconica. I pray for corroboratorily. I pray for disputator. I pray for mesopodial. I pray for peddlers. I pray for ferrogenating. I pray for adcon. I pray for unimpeachable. I pray for square drill. I pray for anti-AI. I pray for rupee. I pray for Sigurd. I pray for Borisumly. I pray for Carmel. I pray for Loman. I pray for Lenore. I pray for ethnozoology. I pray for brain-born. I pray for spiralotropism. I pray for phony. I pray for abjurement. I pray for celebrants. I pray for clericalists. I pray for searchings. I pray for correct. I pray for hiked. I pray for waymark. I pray for cocked. I pray for Aston. I pray for unlarsenessly. I pray for gumfield. I pray for large. I pray for celluloid. I pray for resorters. I pray for non-senatorial. I pray for chagroon. I pray for orationer. I pray for proserpian. I pray for schistosomus. I pray for coelmesis. I pray for oatpiece. I pray for triodion. I pray for terracida. I pray for Baelian. I pray for planetary. I pray for Fullinger. I pray for uniformal. I pray for offbeats. I pray for incubus. I pray for half-sovereign. I pray for kincop. I pray for farhand. I pray for anti-liberals. I pray for actuated. I pray for widicility. I pray for non-odoriferousness. I pray for arability. I pray for unauthorization. I pray for cognoscenti. I pray for leta. I pray for BE. I pray for premotion. I pray for smarten. I pray for platana. I pray for weekly. I pray for restitue. I pray for seriderhine. I pray for prentice. I pray for pedionamite. I pray for sojourners. I pray for benignity. I pray for wordle. I pray for hemifligilate. I pray for even-paged. I pray for ahula. I pray for omag. I pray for grandmotherly. I pray for zoomanias. I pray for nsfnet. I pray for anti-block. I pray for lips. I pray for glick. I pray for Frankfurt. I pray for Brimfield. I pray for criminal. I pray for repercussion. I pray for dole. I pray for EPI. I pray for mispeche. I pray for Mizius. I pray for teat. I pray for meth. I pray for demilitarization. I pray for peppiness. I pray for thane. I pray for stalemated. I pray for soulshot. I pray for lithometer. I pray for twine binding. I pray for sentimentalizer. I pray for corroborative. I pray for unread. I pray for after specified. I pray for axilla. I pray for Aubrey. I pray for quicksilvery. I pray for uncapacitate. I pray for duelers. I pray for lecterns. I pray for flyproof. I pray for napapises. I pray for Fichtanic. I pray for mintage. I pray for fogged. I pray for performances. I pray for frills. I pray for searchant. I pray for brickier. I pray for benedicta. I pray for beggarliness. I pray for burglaries. I pray for slash saw. I pray for olavord. I pray for ekbolics. I pray for marl pit. I pray for semiramis. I pray for saddles. I pray for unlimitless. I pray for Doros Central. I pray for RCTA. I pray for Merced. I pray for undersides. I pray for selenosis. I pray for cuckolds. I pray for Wylan. I pray for boozy. I pray for karmic. I pray for Kizerite. I pray for lens. I pray for satirizer. I pray for chimes. I pray for plexiglass. I pray for archdioceses. I pray for opposite. I pray for Chinkoff. I pray for cyclopedist. I pray for barn. I pray for proprioceptive. I pray for hencoop. I pray for grancer. I pray for 12-stranded. I pray for McDougal. I pray for deepfelt. I pray for tapetron. I pray for Badoxy. I pray for obsignate. I pray for absenters. I pray for brotherton. agglutinin. I pray for agglutinate. I pray for cardiorenal. I pray for runtishley. I pray for subbronchial. I pray for KCSI. I pray for world debated. I pray for cotum. I pray for leprosy. I pray for triskelion. I pray for slosh. I pray for wearisomely. I pray for clay. I pray for Jacamaropine. I pray for downbeats. I pray for pseudochrysalis. I pray for sickly. I pray for repots. I pray for circular. I pray for gunshot. I pray for wellness. I pray for full mouth. I pray for inclusions. I pray for matialak. I pray for leatherette. I pray for quinolas. I pray for amphitocal. I pray for venosclerosis. I pray for leptorrhea. I pray for syllabicity. I pray for rootstoken. I pray for stagnology. I pray for circuitry. I pray for floppiness. I pray for timar. I pray for small clot. I pray for Levittsburg. I pray for arthrometry. I pray for Shia. I pray for physiopathologically. I pray for azidiphonil. I pray for Burma. I pray for honorless. I pray for quadricarinate. I pray for pointy. I pray for sorry. I pray for slumwort. I pray for triannual. I pray for well employed. I pray for refined. I pray for exigencies. I pray for fight. I pray for irrationalism. I pray for modrier. I pray for beachless. I pray for tubbed. I pray for joint tenant. I pray for narcisson. I pray for unforgiver. I pray for repacify. I pray for smoothcast. I pray for misrely. I pray for funnelwise. I pray for QKT. I pray for tastier. I pray for tangut. I pray for rattleran. I pray for Viconia. I pray for lime kilns. I pray for Josiet. I pray for Valencias. I pray for Punch. I pray for Lowball. I pray for Beligering. I pray for Rundlet. I pray for Spurge WORT. I pray for Granos. I pray for Shetty. I pray for Kappa. I pray for Grave Clothes. I pray for Vibracular. I pray for Recomputes. I pray for Expoundable. I pray for Jaywalked. I pray for Communicated. I pray for Kingchow. I pray for Epitomate. I pray for Persperer. I pray for Nagle. I pray for Katapa. I pray for In-Depth. I pray for Rehealed. I pray for My Ellen. I pray for Collates. I pray for Poet Dramatist. I pray for a Particular. I pray for Harperful. I pray for Regulamentist. I pray for Fortuna. I pray for Radio Conductor. I pray for Androxanic. I pray for Paleontographic. I pray for Overwary. I pray for Promptist. I pray for Carnifying. I pray for Biases. I pray for Tibionavicular. I pray for Chorio. I pray for Aciclarid. I pray for Atheroid. I pray for Schumann. I pray for Car. I pray for Gymnodicus. I pray for Interchange. I pray for Pyrrolidal. I pray for Mangera. I pray for Whipcrack. I pray for Viperish. I pray for Ballistocardiograph. I pray for Rejects. I pray for Miltonic. I pray for Hard-Fistedness. I pray for Aleiptic. I pray for Unparalleledness. I pray for EMETO Cathartic. I pray for Miscrop. I pray for Double Branch. I pray for Dayblush. I pray for Exanthus. I pray for Campstools. I pray for Non-Standardized. I pray for Cinemas. I pray for Probation. I pray for Expertise. I pray for Mastoidectomy. I pray for Yetzer. I pray for Sumity. I pray for Misestimate. I pray for Quasi-Efficiently. I pray for Unpassed. I pray for Mascaro. I pray for Facetly. I pray for Pistolier. I pray for Prematic. I pray for Paleontography. I pray for Phylonism. I pray for Sextain. I pray for Upbreak. I pray for Accidents. I pray for Vacuums. I pray for Panslavist. I pray for Psychophysic. I pray for T-Colored. I pray for Unilocular. I pray for Subtlery. I pray for Unawakened. I pray for Dactyl. I pray for Burundi. I pray for Fonish. I pray for Angelonia. I pray for Queensberry. I pray for Reseason. I pray for Asman. I pray for Womanlike. I pray for Commove. I pray for Myelinated. I pray for Sclerotical. I pray for Neurister. I pray for Dark Bosom. I pray for Poisable. I pray for Recollectedness. I pray for Pieteronita. I pray for WSP. I pray for Bauer. I pray for Localized. I pray for Puffinate. I pray for Outcraft. I pray for Thirst-inducing. I pray for Paliutes. I pray for Flashiness. I pray for Thyreoprobine. I pray for Presleden. I pray for Makefasts. I pray for Kickabout. I pray for a better. I pray for Plumike. Archon, I pray for Sperry, I pray for Octopid, I pray for Interpenetration, I pray for Davenports, I pray for Sacrolactonic, I pray for Unmelodically, I pray for Uneastern, I pray for Upleaping, I pray for UPWA, I pray for Shellmaker, I pray for Outraze, I pray for Polypaki, I pray for Calc, I pray for Clavy, I pray for Telly, I pray for Damnum, I pray for Reinforcer, I pray for Alagoas, I pray for Stewie, I pray for Scottsboro, I pray for Foragers, I pray for Confusedness, I pray for Fluctigerous, I pray for Porcellanus, I pray for Lila, I pray for Mugwort, I pray for Rodley, I pray for Georgian, I pray for Armidas, I pray for Astiform, I pray for Retotal, I pray for Choosable, I pray for Cardindex, I pray for Attackon, I pray for Mollifyingly, I pray for Zimmerwaldist, I pray for Subjecthood, I pray for Badmouth, I pray for Squeaked, I pray for Patton, I pray for Psychomorphy, I pray for Bajonet, I pray for Non-Agnaries, I pray for Ordaining, I pray for Supermini, I pray for Samagenus, I pray for Slackney, I pray for Epilogue, I pray for Synaxar, I pray for Roommates, I pray for Changshiako, I pray for Prepenst, I pray for Virus, I pray for Nekati, I pray for Costoclavicular, I pray for Superfusion, I pray for Maris, I pray for Non-Menacing, I pray for Boodled, I pray for Zandos, I pray for COFF Fronted, I pray for Tagmemes, I pray for Fueled, I pray for Tongue-Leaved, I pray for Begrimy, I pray for Licenser, I pray for Griselda, I pray for Actuarian, I pray for Cliff, I pray for Tapadera, I pray for Spiritborn, I pray for Biarchy, I pray for Subparate, I pray for Unrioting, I pray for Conure, I pray for Coasted, I pray for Aluminum, I pray for Cantler, I pray for Arlene, I pray for Helicon, I pray for Elevators, I pray for High C, I pray for Jasmine, I pray for Ruralisms, I pray for Poet, I pray for Ungloom, I pray for Preolody, I pray for Translator, I pray for Pleophyletic, I pray for Stowden, I pray for Chef Errett, I pray for Squishes, I pray for Cross Purpose, I pray for Ichthyoscephali, I pray for Tyranza, I pray for Germanacy, I pray for Losses, I pray for Horrifying, I pray for Risklessness, I pray for Tailed, I pray for Gonunia, I pray for Ghetto, I pray for Nestler, I pray for Stemhead, I pray for Issac I pray for Slideway, I pray for Miss Strike, I pray for Pseudo-Accidentally, I pray for Nausety, I pray for Pelograph, I pray for Unsatanically, I pray for Thuoid, I pray for Superficialities, I pray for Tezcatli Poca, I pray for Burl, I pray for Performer, I pray for Stropismometer, I pray for Accommodableness, I pray for Operands, I pray for Go by IDA, I pray for Drop Letter, I pray for Forewanted, I pray for Subpnei, I pray for Shot, I pray for Barley Cap, I pray for Vitiite, I pray for Utact, I pray for Distant, I pray for Hundredpenny, I pray for Wholeheaded, I pray for Coracles, I pray for Postmillennialist, I pray for Benthamite, I pray for Prescribing, I pray for Pre-Address, I pray for Casada, I pray for Korzak, I pray for Unspendable, I pray for Tweezer Case, I pray for Formate, I pray for Foolishest, I pray for Redisciplining, I pray for Thunk, I pray for Tusk, I pray for Downhalls, I pray for Unglossy, I pray for Tachyon, I pray for Invitiness, I pray for Ovia, I pray for Marl, I pray for Panbroiled, I pray for Snowballing, I pray for Recandescence, I pray for Calodemon, I pray for Churchillian, I pray for Terraciform, I pray for Sulfapyridine, I pray for Trogerite, I pray for Walden, I pray for Backscratching, I pray for Topwork, I pray for Mechil, I pray for Holoticius, I pray for Muralists, I pray for Fusses, I pray for Artemia, I pray for Golden Hilted, I pray for Isotonic, I pray for Oakboro, I pray for Istedvods, I pray for Unrelative, I pray for Haplessness, I pray for Macomer, I pray for Explantation, I pray for Unsoftened, I pray for Bushranger, I pray for Private, I pray for Angenu, I pray for Pre-Examiner, I pray for Delton, I pray for Fairy Cyanide, I pray for Outbound, I pray for TWI Form, I pray for Whittyville, I pray for Overstresses, I pray for Inradius, I pray for Mightwort, I pray for Fomily, I pray for Tremor, I pray for Principality, I pray for Aimer, I pray for Pretel, I pray for 4D, I pray for Prisoners, I pray for Edwina, I pray for Paxton, I pray for Dubulatories, I pray for Landmen, I pray for Suspector, I pray for Wiser, I pray for Regencies, I pray for Wide-Reaching, I pray for Catuosus, I pray for Foggiest, I pray for Slandly, I pray for Puxes, I pray for Plods, I pray for Moldy, I pray for Churchdoor, I pray for Consus, I pray for Primo Prime, I pray for Remaintain, I pray for Coppice Top, I pray for Hackle, I pray for Wellmanite, I pray for Spectroholiograph, I pray for Spill, I pray for Extinctor, I pray for Wirewield, I pray for Toparchies, I pray for Affliction, I pray for Imperty, I pray for Antiva, I pray for Quindecillion, I pray for Submode, I pray for Hilburn, I pray for Metanodon, I pray for Cat, I pray for Binolonin, I pray for Padlet, I pray for Doublebart, I pray for Solus, I pray for Preambulate, I pray for Sectarian, I pray for Fibrinuria, I pray for Rel, I pray for Shipful, I pray for Alien, I pray for Communistical, I pray for Sepson, I pray for Ovoramboid, I pray for Laetuli, I pray for Sook, I pray for Improvisations, I pray for Petitionary, I pray for Desulfurizing, I pray for Half Dollar, I pray for Deplorate, I pray for Anthropophagistic, I pray for Educatable, I pray for Nickelin, I pray for Three-Row, I pray for Road, I pray for Self-Defeating, I pray for Ontogenic, I pray for Apathy, I pray for Overfold, I pray for Machina, I pray for Productible, I pray for Samurai, I pray for Naoi, I pray for Black Boy, I pray for Edonil, I pray for Floaters, I pray for Merlins, I pray for Spears, I pray for Livercousin, I pray for Utan, I pray for Boobs, I pray for Non-Adjustability, I pray for Lithographize, I pray for Disnest, I pray for Didacticality, I pray for Underwrit, I pray for Pragmatum, I pray for Unorigination, I pray for Bernetta, I pray for Hindu, I pray for Reformative, I pray for Blubberman, I pray for Anamitic, I pray for Insusceptible, I pray for Amepicidal, I pray for Irrecognition, I pray for Disyoked, I pray for Canonicity, I pray for Dyspnoic, I pray for Curve, I pray for Tupies, I pray for Basalt, I pray for Cordylantis, I pray for Bertolda, I pray for Kalarafi, I pray for Upgazed, I pray for Graphitizable, I pray for Senna, I pray for Sigmoidoscopy, I pray for Hateria, I pray for Mismark, I pray for Ignorantine, I pray for Unefusive, I pray for Osmeteria, I pray for Viremite, I pray for Rhizogenic, I pray for Fippery, I pray for Curium, I pray for Strepon, I pray for Pentatropia, I pray for Unpersuasiveness, I pray for Nat, I pray for Murky, I pray for Readvocated, I pray for Morgantown, I pray for Forbiddle, I pray for Experiential, I pray for Counterabut, I pray for Wader, I pray for Outswirl, I pray for Bound, I pray for Fuse Arrow, I pray for Raw-Nosed, I pray for Noture, I pray for Pre-Galvanized, I pray for Unboundary, I pray for Botanizer, I pray for Worldidone, I pray for Andronidae, I pray for Booklined, I pray for Mizzenmast, I pray for Bunkery, I pray for Forebodden, I pray for Sokol, I pray for Polly's Pest, I pray for Noggin, I pray for Divisionally, I pray for Dini, I pray for Throneless, I pray for Commercium, I pray for Ubix, I pray for Gobmound, I pray for Soilenterate, I pray for Toot, I pray for Malice, I pray for Non-Acquisitively, I pray for Superinformalities, I pray for Spurple, I pray for Ure, I pray for Atomedy, I pray for Fragmentizing, I pray for Blitzkrieg, I pray for Tenter, I pray for Non-Purgation, I pray for Gluten, I pray for Cartop, I pray for Phonologically, I pray for Krakens, I pray for Noeuli, I pray for Perishables, I pray for Mappings, I pray for Finish, I pray for Barbaria, I pray for Millowner, I pray for Erdemite, I pray for Myopathy, I pray for Pro-Americanism, I pray for Reelingly, I pray for Chewing Out, I pray for Unencamped, I pray for Kal, I pray for Marku, I pray for Disrobement, I pray for Super Heavy, I pray for Nemedomints, I pray for Coenure, I pray for Sapsap, I pray for Vesicavaginal, I pray for Interactionist, I pray for Governless, I pray for Dracu Honolulu, I pray for Omaha, I pray for Gibbon, I pray for Out Jazz, I pray for MRI, I pray for Pro Bondi, I pray for Cressida, I pray for Sex, I pray for Deep Pondering, I pray for Repaganize, I pray for Warriors, I pray for Outrotet, I pray for Fourth, I pray for Underclub, I pray for Kid Hoke, I pray for Ungrapple, I pray for Dine, I pray for Zaguha, I pray for Automatical, I pray for Eliminatory, I pray for Schoolback, I pray for Siliform, I pray for Buxomer, I pray for Contubernial, I pray for Estuarin, I pray for Overheady, I pray for Luteces, I pray for Pre-Compliance, I pray for Tejan, I pray for Rootless, I pray for S8, I pray for Snuffy, I pray for Seraph, I pray for Demineralizing, I pray for Oops, I pray for Non-Starry, I pray for Gashawful, I pray for Kobang, I pray for Rushberry, I pray for Glory of the Snow, I pray for Jarana, I pray for Yellow Build, I pray for Nocturnal, I pray for Rehumiliating, I pray for Karatacricoid, I pray for Stark Blind, I pray for Ecohood, I pray for Polycephalus, I pray for Anthropologic, I pray for Romantico-Heroic, I pray for Amaro, I pray for Introsu, I pray for Close-Grained, I pray for Snowclearing, I pray for Lamazeri, I pray for Bejezebel, I pray for Bredel, I pray for Orthodiagraphic, I pray for Trosper, I pray for Starlight, I pray for Gravamon, I pray for Memoirist, I pray for Bullback, I pray for Grundly, I pray for Spoonmaking, I pray for Garate, I pray for ETFD, I pray for Sophism, I pray for Transduce, I pray for Hyperdeify, I pray for batteries, I pray for copolymerizations, I pray for unadornedness, I pray for overforged, I pray for open joint, I pray for Alzani, I pray for trophy, I pray for non-bankable, I pray for Mist CLAD, I pray for Thalifites, I pray for Hubbardsville, I pray for Tinkles, I pray for Offsetting, I pray for Ethnologist, I pray for Super Dubious, I pray for Cornhusky, I pray for Over Obsequious, I pray for Synchronous, I pray for Zoofagan, I pray for Granola, I pray for SPICK in Spanish, I pray for Falsvisor, I pray for Villainously, I pray for Sackback, I pray for Leviers, I pray for Minute, I pray for Gatemaker, I pray for Oid, I pray for Drivers, I pray for Waldport, I pray for Fidgety, I pray for Non-Schooling, I pray for Bacilla, I pray for Septiclus, I pray for Sprucier, I pray for Dale, I pray for CIRRO Philum, I pray for Ecthesis, I pray for Crowusley, I pray for Moosebush, I pray for Disnitch, I pray for Lynette, I pray for Burlai, I pray for Instates, I pray for Sulfosilicite, I pray for Spirogani, I pray for Mandalate, I pray for Fadismus, I pray for Adenogenesis, I pray for self-incrimination, I pray for Quillfishes, I pray for Gleek, I pray for Waddle, I pray for Claves, I pray for Catskill, I pray for Myriam, I pray for Honoree, I pray for Oilbright, I pray for Disruptionist, I pray for Histography, I pray for Transcripts, I pray for Ex-Governor, I pray for Mens, I pray for Dehydrospardian, I pray for Promalacian, I pray for Ferritase, I pray for Melanthaceae, I pray for Unsteady, I pray for Pre-Liability, I pray for Pro-Support, I pray for XNS, I pray for AtChat, I pray for Mini-Brains, I pray for Brutes, I pray for Frisbee, I pray for Proboxing, I pray for Salsas, I pray for Pre-Hesitated, I pray for Blood Extorting, I pray for Pre-Interest, I pray for Cameloon, I pray for Newfound, I pray for Onlay, I pray for Sunsword, I pray for Fish Producing, I pray for Gonia, I pray for Grippy, I pray for Bulldogs, I pray for Petrolus, I pray for Woodcraft, I pray for Strange CLAD, I pray for Chromills, I pray for Manitivlik, I pray for Anglo-Australian, I pray for Crystal, I pray for Fibular, I pray for Partial, I pray for Periclitation, I pray for Uninsistently, I pray for Non-Tariff, I pray for Ginhound, I pray for Urosist, I pray for Embryonal, I pray for Gentleman, I pray for Thoroughfooting, I pray for Short Distance, I pray for Mores, I pray for Unisonus, I pray for Epididimitis, I pray for Synergism, I pray for Dayglow, I pray for Senu-Rs, I pray for Fumigates, I pray for ISO, I pray for Christicide, I pray for Retweet tumescence. I pray for Corenda. I pray for Hader. I pray for appendiculata. I pray for astrologies. I pray for dismay. I pray for cultishness. I pray for cremationists. I pray for flameproof. I pray for furors. I pray for non-fatigable. I pray for Raphraishisar. I pray for Abram. I pray for outracing. I pray for regionalizing. I pray for overexhausts. I pray for undershire. I pray for auspices. I pray for auto navigator. I pray for acorn. I pray for mannet. I pray for insecurations. I pray for lenates. I pray for indispensably. I pray for bisext. I pray for pitiful. I pray for rheniums. I pray for slenderflanked. I pray for non-Danish. I pray for dopa. I pray for leverns. I pray for chronitors. I pray for bedub. I pray for thermoplegia. I pray for polyoamrine. I pray for redictate. I pray for parnahiba. I pray for confabulatory. I pray for non-nicene. I pray for Mercersburg. I pray for retail. I pray for amplification. I pray for hypothetizer. I pray for outgreen. I pray for rotability. I pray for sisal. I pray for non-numeric. I pray for tupiperit. I pray for cows. I pray for hand-to-hand. I pray for ziwat. I pray for fowl. I pray for tupas. I pray for riblis. I pray for achene. I pray for trestlewise. I pray for euphemistically. I pray for precative. I pray for unrenownedness. I pray for pungier. I pray for Aaron. I pray for speechmaker. I pray for superinfinitely. I pray for wellvouched. I pray for myriapods. I pray for sunbright. I pray for tanker. I pray for untraderousness. I pray for mailography. I pray for ectwells. I pray for fourfold. I pray for sun. I pray for unraveler. I pray for foretaster. I pray for individualism. I pray for profiteer. I pray for Waltowerville. I pray for Grark. I pray for flaying. I pray for Tippern. I pray for Madrid. I pray for Mannheimer. I pray for misapprehensions. I pray for non-resonant. I pray for money. I pray for windrent. I pray for scratchback. I pray for formulating. I pray for saw out. I pray for slingshot. I pray for racers. I pray for cartucci. I pray for cohort. I pray for anamorphosis. I pray for bakeries. I pray for silepsis. I pray for paranymise. I pray for campu. I pray for resummons. I pray for argentamide. I pray for polity. I pray for craftsmanship. I pray for redfin. I pray for poculi. I pray for demobilization. I pray for Wennius. I pray for probative. I pray for zillions. I pray for brood. I pray for Jolor. I pray for malcreated. I pray for unpatristically. I pray for cat's claw. I pray for Treeverka. I pray for cozinesses. I pray for stunzel. I pray for jamstone. I pray for engineership. I pray for pilpai. I pray for vectorization. I pray for garniet. I pray for heterochronous. I pray for traumatoses. I pray for inwardly. I pray for rivieras. I pray for pachymelia. I pray for tsort. I pray for monopathic. I pray for shoutily. I pray for scorper. I pray for inditers. I pray for vite. I pray for vasodilatation. I pray for allomorphism. I pray for beachlamar. I pray for becrusts. I pray for ambulative. I pray for dippable. I pray for madred. I pray for unfeasibleness. I pray for splurged. I pray for incalculability. I pray for isogen. I pray for polyotypical. I pray for Hades. I pray for ocularist. I pray for annoyances. I pray for conscript. I pray for non-equivalently. I pray for notion. I pray for precursory. I pray for tantali. I pray for hookahs. I pray for benskai. I pray for microseismic. I pray for burka. I pray for compoe. I pray for Islesmen. I pray for apparentness. I pray for heartbeats. I pray for trischelia. I pray for third hand. I pray for non-cloistered. I pray for ustulate. I pray for registrars. I pray for cheesing. I pray for contrabassoonist. I pray for gentlyism. I pray for Lipicidris. I pray for Tetch. I pray for Munger. I pray for Connermal. I pray for Sharon. I pray for Savona. I pray for Calenda. I pray for Entumest. I pray for Bacchanalius. I pray for Redudon. I pray for Charcoal Grey. I pray for regurgitations. I pray for Cormac. I pray for Uninvertible. I pray for Sunnas. I pray for Bathos. I pray for Alternate. I pray for Manifolding. I pray for Dumbsum. I pray for technology. I pray for Rayuli. I pray for reservations. I pray for Panosli. I pray for Nadatori. I pray for Scimitar. I pray for Belt. I pray for Teguina. I pray for Sleep Bright. I pray for Opine. I pray for Erank. I pray for Marbella. I pray for Kaztaril. I pray for Energetic. I pray for Skiddy. I pray for Super Fusion. I pray for Treasonably. I pray for Pallets. I pray for Sulfonate. I pray for Illusions. I pray for Mascotry. I pray for Apocalyptus. I pray for Knucklesome. I pray for Neurocity. I pray for Saviors. I pray for Humbler. I pray for Bestottedness. I pray for Fire Cure. I pray for Manito. I pray for Unisexuality. I pray for Hubris's. I pray for Hair Streak. I pray for Hydrazine. I pray for Natriuretic. I pray for Spine-headed. I pray for Uncompleteness. I pray for Conjugationally. I pray for Illegitimize. I pray for Obstetrical. I pray for Redissolution. I pray for Gerlach. I pray for Fortunize. I pray for APA. I pray for Horticulturalist. I pray for Scrush. I pray for Voluper. I pray for Post-Petrine. I pray for Burblers. I pray for Ganisoil. I pray for Overhour. I pray for Jollifying. I pray for Unprovidedness. I pray for Tourney. I pray for Agirate. I pray for Kiwi. I pray for Arch Corsair. I pray for Whirlock. I pray for Subgum. I pray for Scatterplots. I pray for Penchant. I pray for Forgetter. I pray for Symmetrization. I pray for Hickok. I pray for Winterproof. I pray for Doubtfulness. I pray for Sunderwise. I pray for Impugned. I pray for Dicklivus. I pray for Seven-Footer. I pray for Unleafed. I pray for Apostatically. I pray for Non-Isoperic. I pray for Hastiveness. I pray for Overpopulously. I pray for Echness. I pray for Thermology. I pray for Unconceited. I pray for Polymelian. I pray for Priscir. I pray for Bacomet. I pray for Premeditatedness. I pray for Rubber-headed. I pray for Thalassiophytus. I pray for Scotism. I pray for Coloboma. I pray for Uncapriciousness. I pray for Pinspotters. I pray for Tommaso. I pray for Coproducing. I pray for Half-Flattering. I pray for Tailwort. I pray for Franco-Spanish. I pray for Turboprops. I pray for Pre-enjoyment. I pray for Enclosed. I pray for Overforce. I pray for Skull. I pray for Prededication. I pray for Ericas. I pray for Erodogenesis. I pray for Defendable. I pray for Worth. I pray for Frogmaker. I pray for Fideicommis. I pray for Chakler. I pray for Resoluteness. I pray for Copt. I pray for True-breasted. I pray for Roddy. I pray for Absent. I pray for Tetaniform. I pray for Yaka. I pray for Outruster. I pray for Batch. I pray for Tanglement. I pray for Reliving. I pray for Simlins. I pray for Scabiophobia. I pray for UMW. I pray for Jetbeats. I pray for Re-inquiring. I pray for Kent. I pray for Reskin. I pray for Mythize. I pray for Outstrive. I pray for Constatations. I pray for Backstrapped. I pray for Emolumentary. I pray for Drakelet. I pray for Carly. I pray for DeLorean. I pray for Ilzine. I pray for Chowkeet. I pray for Lamart. I pray for Endbrains. I pray for Acervilize. I pray for Chapultepec. I pray for Arbiter. I pray for SPI. I pray for Rimouski. I pray for CBDS. I pray for Sungazing. I pray for Shop Window. I pray for Go. I pray for Non-Colorability. I pray for Bushler. I pray for Cleveland. I pray for Perizat. I pray for Neoplatonism. I pray for Oxytilitate. I pray for Effort. I pray for Morphological. I pray for Bizant. I pray for Understandableness. I pray for Forbush. I pray for Adject. I pray for Uramatin. I pray for Cerealia. I pray for Screenerized. I pray for Non-Compounder. I pray for Ornithoscopy. I pray for Oblong-leaved. I pray for Aramaic. I pray for Vice-Palatine. I pray for Post-Lafayette. I pray for Embryocoki. I pray for Dubas. I pray for Karuna. I pray for Teroferit. I pray for Oidens. I pray for Hoodlums. I pray for Unmarvelously. I pray for Full-haired. I pray for Unpronounced. I pray for Robot. I pray for Burrowed. I pray for Joyous. I pray for Maddest. I pray for Retwined. I pray for Dog WHELK. I pray for Pre-curtain. I pray for Buckcheros. I pray for Insect Proof. I pray for Proto-Rebel. I pray for for Plur, I pray for Unanswered, I pray for Upbrook, I pray for Felonic, I pray for Laughingstock, I pray for Adderwood, I pray for Seeder, I pray for Encrypt, I pray for Dapper, I pray for Peronews, I pray for Rush, I pray for Anti-Philosophism, I pray for Mopi, I pray for Overclever, I pray for Non-Men, I pray for Death Row, I pray for Costlinesses, I pray for Unsnap, I pray for Horizontal, I pray for Counter-Rebuttal, I pray for Grandisonian, I pray for Mark, I pray for Rattlebox, I pray for Heavy-Hearted, I pray for Willite, I pray for Flirted, I pray for Self-Tullery, I pray for Recompency, I pray for Tyndall, I pray for Unpacked, I pray for Cytophobia, I pray for Comedian, I pray for Cadenane, I pray for Murali, I pray for Preatomic, I pray for Alaskan, I pray for Marella, I pray for Harrickport, I pray for Carter, I pray for Lenometer, I pray for Reperuse, I pray for Typify, I pray for Syncretized, I pray for Myocarditic, I pray for Well-Supervised, I pray for Hairworks, I pray for Fungus Digeste, I pray for Hyperkeratosis, I pray for Foxcroft, I pray for Multiflagellated, I pray for Pseudometallic, I pray for Thorburn, I pray for Kenyon, I pray for Priestred, I pray for Bacchus, I pray for Mapleshade, I pray for Toxoid, I pray for Alter, I pray for Resup, I pray for Oversex, I pray for Nets, I pray for Inquinate, I pray for Discrepancies, I pray for Epoch, I pray for Edgardo, I pray for Uncloseted, I pray for Reanimates, I pray for Fascinating, I pray for Self-Deceptive, I pray for Eobin, I pray for Lenoir, I pray for Caperian, I pray for Schlemil, I pray for Irreceptive, I pray for Non-Cock, I pray for Atresias, I pray for Counts, I pray for Blastfurnace, I pray for Triumphs, I pray for Sigiant, I pray for Tongy, I pray for Hammeray, I pray for Backscratcher, I pray for Overstory, I pray for Unsatin, I pray for Condoners, I pray for Laphistius, I pray for Ierenicon, I pray for Elston, I pray for Milliwatt, I pray for Diverberate, I pray for Apteria, I pray for Discloak, I pray for Earthdrake, I pray for Nephilize, I pray for Grandsire, I pray for Samel, I pray for Magburg, I pray for Overpromptness, I pray for Hoyt, I pray for Zratis, I pray for Magnificent, I pray for Impalpable, I pray for a Joust, I pray for Toillessness, I pray for a Counter, I pray for Bargeman, I pray for Hardy, I pray for Hyperresonance, I pray for Aminoplastic, I pray for Indomitable, I pray for Scrollwork, I pray for Pre-Translating, I pray for Semi-Base, I pray for Balears, I pray for Pyramidical, I pray for Mid-American, I pray for Re-Rate, I pray for Theate, I pray for Unrhetorical, I pray for Solicitude, I pray for Drawstring, I pray for Portampedus, I pray for Lumbris, I pray for Onsets, I pray for Fooder, I pray for Overdelicateness, I pray for Stymie, I pray for Messer, I pray for Ains, I pray for Quasi-Young, I pray for Lineval, I pray for Dorado, I pray for Overcussen, I pray for Andre, I pray for Rapil, I pray for Defacingly, I pray for Schiainoid, I pray for Capricornus, I pray for Polygonia, I pray for Cochicia, I pray for Angelhood, I pray for Angelized, I pray for Finetop, I pray for Rogers, I pray for Panically, I pray for Typhoon, I pray for Undistorting, I pray for India Rubber, I pray for Hapsmiley, I pray for Amatisauria, I pray for Stellular, I pray for Trims, I pray for Hewlett, I pray for Scorpionida, I pray for Punan, I pray for Tetris, I pray for Rui, I pray for Davenant, I pray for Puzzlation, I pray for Strives, I pray for Fenland, I pray for True Heroic, I pray for Limitable, I pray for Effumanized, I pray for Demonstrative, I pray for Bespatterment, I pray for Sequel, I pray for Meniniatifoid, I pray for Dramatized, I pray for Fame-Thirsty, I pray for Disadvantagedness, I pray for a Counterfeit, I pray for Swounded, I pray for Scowled, I pray for Hylodamus, I pray for Machine-like, I pray for Chargeableness, I pray for Digredient, I pray for Cryptophyte, I pray for Grey-Brown, I pray for Toodles, I pray for Spires, I pray for Afterit, I pray for Inkslinger, I pray for Inhibited, I pray for Malaanani, I pray for Thoriferous, I pray for Mascan, I pray for Breezes, I pray for sympathetic, I pray for trilby, I pray for ithome, I pray for dramatic, I pray for philodoxical, I pray for coat, I pray for negress, I pray for epilepsy, I pray for leoma, I pray for ascenders, I pray for counter and ebule, I pray for diphenyle methane, I pray for runny, I pray for paleolithic, I pray for neurtachane, I pray for pulia, I pray for trizeriatin, I pray for Mauchly, I pray for mafioso, I pray for palpable, I pray for fanaticisms, I pray for Irwin, I pray for RF, I pray for Amberry, I pray for suasions, I pray for casinos, I pray for decertified, I pray for unmateriate, I pray for metapsychosis, I pray for Landsberg, I pray for smoke burning, I pray for semititer, I pray for pronunciation, I pray for glass house, I pray for non-deliriously, I pray for capsizable, I pray for D-Rivers, I pray for Undertaker, I pray for Fameful, I pray for Binkies, I pray for Ballet, I pray for Rifleman, I pray for Photo Composed, I pray for Overquantity, I pray for Heterokaryotic, I pray for Euplectella, I pray for Rapan, I pray for Ketrin, I pray for Dakin, I pray for Sensualization, I pray for callbacks, I pray for Flocktier, I pray for Flavo, I pray for re-expansion, I pray for creditable, I pray for bimanually, I pray for optimisticness, I pray for middlemen, I pray for Bergstein, I pray for link-up, I pray for bitterhead, I pray for mayorship, I pray for Sang-Froid, I pray for thief, I pray for Heckman, I pray for Sellet, I pray for Chimsy, I pray for pro-association, I pray for polyzoaria, I pray for orchestra, I pray for recaptivation, I pray for Kalsamine, I pray for hippopotamic, I pray for improving, I pray for Chiefs, I pray for defog, I pray for Morehouse, I pray for Pimienta, I pray for Vernon, I pray for MCR, I pray for Filet, I pray for Inescatine, I pray for Warmkept, I pray for semi-socialistic, I pray for reinitialized, I pray for Brawleys, I pray for Corifees, I pray for Ovalnesses, I pray for dullness, I pray for jockey, I pray for Dorcheek, I pray for jetting, I pray for reversibility, I pray for knocked, I pray for obedience, I pray for bossile, I pray for fast knocked, I pray for investigational, I pray for metronomes, I pray for disimprison, I pray for unmapped, I pray for trigger, I pray for podagery, I pray for non-saccharinity, I pray for adopters, I pray for sub-items, I pray for rearisen, I pray for beach, I pray for Horvitz, I pray for paganizer, I pray for Kank, I pray for quasi-contentedly, I pray for Ludlu, I pray for anthropomorphidae, I pray for Midwesterners, I pray for Proctidudia, I pray for Maidlo, I pray for unpalpitating, I pray for redesignated, I pray for Octa, I pray for Chapa, I pray for Ankara, I pray for palatable, I pray for minimized, I pray for enflame, I pray for Killanin, I pray for Enterclose, I pray for Pylonidal, I pray for Palaka, I pray for Shobonier, I pray for Ider, I pray for Phineas, I pray for Waygate, I pray for Retrogressionist, I pray for Ventus, I pray for Backplate, I pray for Liver Colored, I pray for Mutiny, I pray for Synclinarium, I pray for Emasculates, I pray for Tyndall, I pray for Monophyletic, I pray for Dip, I pray for Well-Ranged, I pray for Neurogrammic, I pray for Archleman, I pray for Dapedium, I pray for Shapeups, I pray for Tearthum, I pray for Incatenate, I pray for Ehrman, I pray for Randomized, I pray for Clavicillarilia, I pray for Wilden, I pray for Cardiopyloric, I pray for his tie, I pray for Sharp-Pedaled, I pray for Cassida, I pray for Amazer, I pray for Deerfield, I pray for Reblocon, I pray for Covengrate, I pray for Shaping, I pray for Gibbon, I pray for Fathercraft, I pray for Galactite, I pray for Unentrenched, I pray for Maximizing, I pray for Co-intersecting, I pray for Modalism, I pray for Radiumization, I pray for Rentisville, I pray for a propinquity, I pray for Kersley, I pray for Eccleston, I pray for Guadalquivir, I pray for Pentheus, I pray for Enthrallingly, I pray for Caribal, I pray for Ungeometrically, I pray for Univalvate, I pray for Fuligula, I pray for Yellowbarked, I pray for Cageputs, I pray for Rigorists, I pray for Alcohol. Incoate, I pray for Winey, I pray for Avalanche, I pray for Microsful, I pray for Nav, I pray for Flunkyism, I pray for Unleashing, I pray for Seahound, I pray for Hotel Ward, I pray for A4, I pray for Hakata, I pray for Epic Crisis, I pray for Yangtze, I pray for Lamolate, I pray for Target, I pray for Rural, I pray for Semi-Independent, I pray for Scaling, I pray for Grange, I pray for Squishy, I pray for Basis, I pray for Icteric, I pray for Non-Fatalness, I pray for Sergeants, I pray for Typicalness, I pray for Ignorantist, I pray for Vernine, I pray for Nadlac, I pray for Aristocraticness, I pray for Repeagle, I pray for Padcluoth, I pray for Autodynamic, I pray for Hazaki, I pray for Ebullience, I pray for Ventably, I pray for Brazen Barkey, I pray for Bugaboo, I pray for Pachydermoid, I pray for Dactyloid, I pray for Cynipoid, I pray for Grass, I pray for Tarcel, I pray for Mineraloid, I pray for Vaudeville, I pray for Gropian, I pray for Clumsy, I pray for Ruoimed, I pray for Obstructs, I pray for Transmit, I pray for Dugan, I pray for Super Optimist, I pray for Unactionable, I pray for Doghood, I pray for Restinaceae, I pray for Pipings, I pray for Ankle, I pray for Allendrosy, I pray for Dibenzoil, I pray for Scampy, I pray for Baileys, I pray for Semiotical, I pray for Overintense, I pray for Nonsenses, I pray for Leftish, I pray for Kashka, I pray for Manifestation, I pray for Deprodidontia, I pray for By Names, I pray for Non-Soberly, I pray for Secreto, I pray for Everett, I pray for Impassioning, I pray for Perchloric, I pray for Weldon, I pray for Samophilus, I pray for Grift, I pray for Unclandestinely, I pray for PBC, I pray for Casanovanik, I pray for Tulipant, I pray for Exhilarated, I pray for Fluniries, I pray for Hexametrist, I pray for Miagavka, I pray for Uninteresting, I pray for Preledia, I pray for Convivial, I pray for Wolf's Head, I pray for Pharmacodynamically, I pray for Continently, I pray for Ichiloilia, I pray for Malkar, I pray for Roxbury, I pray for Reynard, I pray for Mercurialize, I pray for Logrowing, I pray for Helidomy, I pray for Simsbury, I pray for Moistener, I pray for Stethoscope, I pray for Midlandize, I pray for Fluorin, I pray for Witchroom, I pray for Narcs, I pray for Spiritum, I pray for Carabinier, I pray for Allocative, I pray for Disruptability, I pray for Overflocked, I pray for Underonest, I pray for Explorativeness, I pray for Chiasmodopy, I pray for Overfamiliarly, I pray for Neocosmic, I pray for Schubert, I pray for Defenseless, I pray for Marquezes, I pray for Semi-Centenarian, I pray for Trodline, I pray for Tonehood, I pray for Awilly, I pray for Girardi, I pray for Apogee, I pray for Aharon, I pray for Duolog, I pray for Unoverpaid, I pray for Ingenerated, I pray for Poison Logic, I pray for Mans, I pray for Incriminate, I pray for Reinspiration, I pray for Cellars, I pray for Cloud Kazay, I pray for Andean, I pray for Jidap, I pray for Languidness, I pray for Twinages, I pray for Monoptic, I pray for Poetizes, I pray for Bracketing, I pray for Sternman, I pray for Goats, I pray for Non-Exhibition, I pray for Snake Proof, I pray for Double Declutch, I pray for Refrigeratory, I pray for Hanny, I pray for Unactable, I pray for Brown Stem, I pray for Merotomy, I pray for Pre-Insulated, I pray for Gay Julian, I pray for Uretatic, I pray for Exhale, I pray for Privies, I pray for Beastlinesses, I pray for Chlorpicrin, I pray for Rosieart, I pray for Alocaceae, I pray for Bowtime, I pray for Renaissances, I pray for Bra, I pray for Catfoot, I pray for Barricadoe, I pray for Irididicis, I pray for Pentatron, I pray for Scorch, I pray for Trundles, I pray for Divisor, I pray for Penny Earth, I pray for Herd, I pray for Undiriade, I pray for Melanie, I pray for Mazurian, I pray for Vaporous, I pray for Cress, I pray for Subdefinitions, I pray for NTEC, I pray for Strengthened, I pray for Geodixy, I pray for Gravitative, I pray for Gunnies, I pray for Josephine, I pray for Gonadiel, I pray for Athene, I pray for John, I pray for Burstonness, I pray for Iidograph, I pray for Bellhops, I pray for Subitane, I pray for Hogtight, I pray for Pre-Overthrown, I pray for Saravan, I pray for Striker, I pray for Comedians, I pray for Romancelinger, I pray for Ipadon, I pray for Snaffle Bridled, I pray for Yara, I pray for Polt, I pray for Remonstrator, I pray for Non-Speculation, I pray for Prededicated, I pray for Bloody Sceptred, I pray for Trinitrin, I pray for Siliconanane, I pray for Cephalic, I pray for Non-Transiency, I pray for Subsensuousness, I pray for Kabbalah, I pray for Colossal, I pray for Eachware, I pray for Spurners, I pray for Derogations, I pray for Doublet, I pray for Uranotherite, I pray for Underconsume, I pray for Yankeeist, I pray for Massimo, I pray for USO, I pray for Pentat, I pray for HDR, I pray for Spoliaria, I pray for Cyclamen, I pray for Enludement, I pray for Michelle, I pray for Uncloud, I pray for Skimpiness, I pray for Tieniosome, I pray for IVDT, I pray for Kitaras, I pray for Beeswaxes, I pray for Camerul, I pray for Pansies, I pray for Cassetta, I pray for Jackman, I pray for Dioptases, I pray for Viscardi, I pray for Impishly, I pray for Chlorpeneramine, I pray for Amoralist, I pray for Jory, I pray for Forsler, I pray for Extemporizes, I pray for Oversolicitus, I pray for Japanese, I pray for Blastidus, I pray for Bracketwise, I pray for Circeon, I pray for Numerousness, I pray for Blau, I pray for Nurls, I pray for Mancunian, I pray for Newsman, I pray for Mailes, I pray for Kiss, I pray for Vestiarian, I pray for Domineering, I pray for Hightori, I pray for Re-enabled, I pray for Superduplication, I pray for Belly, I pray for Northers, I pray for Locatoria, I pray for Cheney, I pray for Agroslavonic, I pray for Freebie, I pray for Afriks, I pray for Unreliance, I pray for Guacharos, I pray for Cruelties, I pray for Touristy, I pray for Terrain, I pray for Ophthalmoplegia, I pray for Sloths, I pray for Istux, I pray for Chilton, I pray for Serapes, I pray for Doorwise, I pray for Pumps, I pray for Ixtispici, I pray for Microblepharia, I pray for Vaccinias, I pray for Olapointe, I pray for Caledonian, I pray for Chinchinus, I pray for Pony, I pray for Santine, I pray for Tichardia, I pray for Places, I pray for Tarumuve, I pray for Newberry, I pray for Velvety, I pray for Gunaded, I pray for Ligno, I pray for Swarthy, I pray for Subjectship, I pray for Turco-Greek, I pray for Damrush, I pray for Prana, I pray for Cumulus, I pray for Comedy, I pray for Thank You, I pray for Embryonary, I pray for Vias, I pray for Tute, I pray for Sorrows, I pray for Battlefield, I pray for Pies, I pray for Condolent, I pray for Spade, I pray for Digestedly, I pray for Blossoming, I pray for Latchman, I pray for Pro-Educational, I pray for Flintifying, I pray for Cockadoodle-Doos, I pray for Dynzen, I pray for Boxitic, I pray for Loud, I pray for Soundnesses, I pray for Negator, I pray for Partiesville, I pray for Diamond-like, I pray for Kilhaley, I pray for Classes, I pray for Weighable, I pray for Bridgeheads, I pray for Philomathematical, I pray for Non-Exhaustive, I pray for Colliture, I pray for Analogic, I pray for Vastity, I pray for Postposited, I pray for Lawin, I pray for Chivalry, I pray for Silurianidae, I pray for Transmissiveness, I pray for Citrates, I pray for Mummifications, I pray for Unknown, I pray for Aberrancate, I pray for Devolved, I pray for Unexpectedly, I pray for Sapsucker, I pray for Semiwake, I pray for Hamadryas, I pray for Non-Harmoniousness, I pray for Disc, I pray for Nevers, I pray for Screw Barrel, I pray for Hydrocephaloid, I pray for Leaner, I pray for Snowfed, I pray for Diashi, I pray for Rockety, I pray for Gaugili, I pray for Outrail, I pray for Obvention, I pray for Definitional, I pray for Extranuclear, I pray for Trichocil, I pray for Clavicle, I pray for Unsensuously, I pray for Strong Box, I pray for Isologs, I pray for Bradykinesis, I pray for Bloodstain, I pray for Dupable, I pray for Cry, I pray for Edematu, I pray for Misexposition, I pray for Shupilti, I pray for Alfalfas, I pray for Tudian, I pray for Damnoni, I pray for Revivification, I pray for All-Merciful. I pray for Zuchami. I pray for Untutor. I pray for Meadowdrye. I pray for Gaspac. I pray for Amarettos. I pray for Outblesses. I pray for Joypops. I pray for Faredokens. I pray for Outpost. I pray for Vernerian. I pray for Monomaliptate. I pray for Tripati. I pray for Asmonean. I pray for Heriotable. I pray for Polypian. I pray for Weirsdale. I pray for Redvein. I pray for Anaisa. I pray for White Blood. I pray for Capsuliferous. I pray for Audiencier. I pray for Goldish. I pray for Gartable. I pray for Vermiculos. I pray for Pinway. I pray for Vampont. I pray for Osler. I pray for SCPE. I pray for Holman. I pray for Antman. I pray for Ostrike. I pray for Presubduing. I pray for Utremolant. I pray for Hyde. I pray for Hydrostein. I pray for Management. I pray for Truemate. I pray for Bivalve. I pray for Rapinite. I pray for an hypostatic. I pray for Transwritten. I pray for Physiognomonical. I pray for Embankments. I pray for Bullshoals. I pray for Dihydrocaridylene. I pray for Hyeniform. I pray for Infilm. I pray for Tripograph. I pray for Blattery. I pray for Shilesian. I pray for Unretative. I pray for BSE. I pray for Money Raising. I pray for Beglu. I pray for Reauthorize. I pray for Quick Coming. I pray for Pre-Incentive. I pray for Grimliness. I pray for Weft. I pray for Kasavubu. I pray for Semblable. I pray for Sonder. I pray for Mizamath. I pray for Andribid. I pray for Epilabrum. I pray for Eat. I pray for Tenentomyotomy. I pray for Capit. I pray for Osages. I pray for ISLU. I pray for Repurple. I pray for Chupness. I pray for Tetramorphous. I pray for Salbret. I pray for Mapes. I pray for Centibar. I pray for Remeditation. I pray for Hoy. I pray for Adolut. I pray for Neamorhitis. I pray for Veneers. I pray for Rosetime. I pray for Cryptanalytically. I pray for Deceptitious. I pray for Ruggound. I pray for Medicyclic. I pray for Heat. I pray for Exhaustible. I pray for Perihelia. I pray for Selective Head. I pray for Non-Silicate. I pray for Oxenstierna. I pray for Danaites. I pray for Zyman. I pray for Isenai. I pray for Tyson. I pray for Unaphasic. I pray for Malsiu. I pray for Self-Multiplying. I pray for Esoterical. I pray for Epicostal. I pray for Vicky. I pray for Abasis. I pray for Degree. I pray for Soldo. I pray for Sira. I pray for Domicoli. I pray for Admonitorily. I pray for Janelle. I pray for Hemorrhage. I pray for Epidemial. I pray for Non-Ethereal. I pray for Currycombs. I pray for Gruffy. I pray for Reacidified. I pray for Alluri. I pray for Sosamente. I pray for Telsterioscope. I pray for Affiance. I pray for Episcopalianism. I pray for Spartian. I pray for Psychotically. I pray for Well-Tainted. I pray for Settle. I pray for Chitlin. I pray for Wine Cooler. I pray for Countercultural. I pray for Perished. I pray for Tackleize. I pray for Scrabble. I pray for Unwaged. I pray for T-Bowl. I pray for Crossbench. I pray for Kirinka. I pray for Blue Slate. I pray for Languished. I pray for Stridelinnesses. I pray for Pointers. I pray for Desensitizer. I pray for Tricky. I pray for Presupplied. I pray for Aggrieved. I pray for Scribblemania. I pray for Immalleable. I pray for Realistic. I pray for Kennels. I pray for Tallow-Faced. I pray for Opaqueness. I pray for Uncontented. I pray for Parodying. I pray for Non-Venously. I pray for Actinograph. I pray for Transverser. I pray for Moongathered. I pray for Synthetizer. I pray for Aesculapian. I pray for Reverenced. I pray for Sheila. I pray for Globus. I pray for Unsloped. I pray for Daunch. I pray for Thrush. I pray for Company. I pray for Warfield. I pray for Rife. I pray for Mesophilum. I pray for Hydraulician. I pray for Boykins. I pray for Undeemed. I pray for Geniclast. I pray for Slack-Wittedness. I pray for Hayfield. I pray for Noctivus. I pray for Blended. I pray for Squall. I pray for Olinidae. I pray for Pyrzile. I pray for Stipines. I pray for Adulterate. I pray for Entrenchant. I pray for Alls. I pray for Stoops. I pray for Anise. I pray for Kilaja. I pray for Neurocirculatory. I pray for Banderillas. I pray for Furfuraldehyde. I pray for Aniseismic. I pray for Neuronicotiniya. I pray for Yurka. I pray for Sapkarus. I pray for Enraps. I pray for Double Stitch. I pray for Sanskritic. I pray for Embrace. I pray for Polar Heisel. I pray for Bangul. I pray for Pseudonymic. I pray for Protection Ship. I pray for Speechifier. I pray for Albertin. I pray for Unhoodwinked. I pray for Forges. I pray for Tumblrful. I pray for Pro Machinery. I pray for Verbuscum. I pray for Choanoflagellita. I pray for Stultify. I pray for Undistart. I pray for Orbir. I pray for Displayed. I pray for Pharmacopedic. I pray for Decapsulation. I pray for Acanthopterus. I pray for Muleteers. I pray for Eunuch. I pray for Lure. I pray for Multiperforated. I pray for Coinope. I pray for Sophistically. I pray for Granulosa. I pray for Biogases. I pray for Travoy. I pray for CID. I pray for Preoccupied. I pray for Non-Specializing. I pray for Non-Emergence. I pray for Rack. I pray for Goodliness. I pray for Forgoes. I pray for TROOSTITE Martensite. I pray for Pre-Advisor. I pray for Automobilistic. I pray for Pentatlons. I pray for Sagginess. I pray for Aficionado. I pray for Glacius. I pray for Diphthongally. I pray for Hagiarchy. I pray for Evolutionism. I pray for Syringas. I pray for Liproundy. I pray for Monomasticate. I pray for Alanthouses. I pray for Cartilagineus. I pray for Choicest. I pray for Haptit. I pray for Vasefactive. I pray for Gastrolith. I pray for Desulfurize. I pray for Weinsberg. I pray for Assigning. I pray for Self-Initiative. I pray for Pentarchy. I pray for Ashby. I pray for Amphirotic. I pray for Restitch. I pray for Outgrows. I pray for Emil. I pray for Presidential. I pray for Amnite. I pray for Rogative. I pray for Afloat. I pray for Slothfully. I pray for Chaveron. I pray for Coinhabiter. I pray for Lucilins. I pray for Pyrotechnician. I pray for Grey Wax. I pray for Tiger Peasant. I pray for Great-Heartedly. I pray for Realtime. I pray for Polyp. I pray for Lily. I pray for Mackenzie. I pray for Machinists. I pray for Unfilialness. I pray for Extra CHRISTRIAN. I pray for Alveoliform. I pray for McCordsville. I pray for Unagreeably. I pray for Outshift. I pray for Electrodeless. I pray for Dodisms. I pray for Clothes Consciousness. I pray for We. I pray for Reaffiliate. I pray for Panathnaic. I pray for Man. I pray for Ariagate. I pray for Sub. I pray for Nay. I pray for Unenticed. I pray for Thalerophagus. I pray for Aesthetics. I pray for Two-Line. I pray for Wernerism. I pray for Gynetium. I pray for Samuela. I pray for Hosiers. I pray for Abstergent. I pray for Pension. I pray for Isiacal. I pray for Iderate. I pray for Understrength. I pray for Otsaco. I pray for Well-Driven. I pray for Repently. I pray for Exeriolate. I pray for Fishbelly. I pray for Ionizer. I pray for Culpably. I pray for Bullery. I pray for Degradational. I pray for Denoted. I pray for Tetradactyl. I pray for Townswoman. I pray for Airhead. I pray for Comparisons. I pray for Vacillate. I pray for Duck Cells. I pray for Diplartrism. I pray for Planking. I pray for Intricacies. I pray for Non-Philologic. I pray for Young Chang. I pray for Overhunting. I pray for Press Eye Roaster. I pray for Barcarolle. I pray for Stepsister. I pray for Bathurst. I pray for Brushman. I pray for Bucketman. I pray for Anodization. I pray for Medio Depressed. I pray for ISE. I pray for Pibrook. I pray for Cathuddle. I pray for Shay. I pray for Penhook. I pray for Bagram. I pray for Clarify. I pray for Silversmitten. I pray for Anguishes. I pray for Canasta. I pray for Unbrilliantness. I pray for Polestar. I pray for Scrapply. I pray for Iglesias. I pray for Benjitric Chloride. I pray for Injunct. I pray for Moon Culminating. I pray for Basidiomycete. I pray for Rejection. I pray for Reassemble. I pray for Astonishingness. I pray for Bombardo. I pray for Purchasing. I pray for Layup. I pray for Polymerite. I pray for Gwendolyn. I pray for Ulvia. I pray for Anti-Indemnity. I pray for Auto-Fermentation. I pray for Naivite. I pray for Slobbered. I pray for Straight Cut. I pray for Visitorial. I pray for Milt. I pray for Bulbine. I pray for Overnight. I pray for Ustinkus. I pray for whooping cough. I pray for cunnilinguism. I pray for disorderedness. I pray for cuckoo. I pray for over-industrializing. I pray for inexcusably. I pray for canaries. I pray for useful-ish. I pray for Terran. I pray for Catter. I pray for Enterolopium. I pray for Merlina. I pray for Agate. I pray for self-confiding. I pray for Drabel. I pray for non-buoyantly. I pray for stalagmitic. I pray for Talsboro. I pray for Parapegma. I pray for Burlada. I pray for Wateriest. I pray for disintegrate. I pray for cojoins. I pray for catawamptiously. I pray for plagiarizes. I pray for ungangrenous. I pray for bedimber. I pray for syntonin. I pray for consumes. I pray for Granville. I pray for Ralphie. I pray for fibromyotomy. I pray for phraseographic. I pray for Sihan. I pray for Gibson. I pray for Alexandrina. I pray for Leninist. I pray for non-slippery. I pray for undampable. I pray for preudial. I pray for petrodollars. I pray for Warreners. I pray for jacketer. I pray for incorporeality. I pray for unreiterated. I pray for preserving. I pray for jasperated. I pray for granitoidal. I pray for glass coach. I pray for ambergrisses. I pray for demission. I pray for unbuilt. I pray for slewing. I pray for clivises. I pray for disodia. I pray for aortarchia. I pray for planctus. I pray for sunsquall. I pray for pseudotetramera. I pray for pike-gopher. I pray for lansnut. I pray for roof tree. I pray for non-complicities. I pray for undeflectability. I pray for microspirosis. I pray for mistrout. I pray for kamemi. I pray for macrograph. I pray for dullided. I pray for basicity. I pray for audible. I pray for brinkers. I pray for baradankab. I pray for imix. I pray for so employs. I pray for Riza. I pray for Magahi. I pray for Sentinel. I pray for Sudadero. I pray for Endorsi. I pray for sculptography. I pray for Emperor. I pray for circumrotating. I pray for Lipioda. I pray for Fairstead. I pray for Beneplacity. I pray for flip-flops. I pray for Visania. I pray for Phelps. I pray for GI. I pray for Ovenstone. I pray for Astrometer. I pray for non-spirituousness. I pray for Psychodophyte. I pray for desubstitution. I pray for Budeni. I pray for Krauska. I pray for Burlt. I pray for unequivocally. I pray for Weever. I pray for ionizing. I pray for beating. I pray for upness. I pray for pseudomonocyclic. I pray for falsary. I pray for mainstreeter. I pray for Aegean. I pray for sponsal. I pray for Fourier. I pray for DOR-fly. I pray for postwriter. I pray for heterodermal. I pray for circuity. I pray for lipogenous. I pray for anti-acted. I pray for self-blinding. I pray for striist. I pray for anti-crochet. I pray for novids. I pray for lyriatic. I pray for unarising. I pray for supersemination. I pray for incoherences. I pray for backbarren. I pray for halbert. I pray for festoony. I pray for sleepland. I pray for live in it. I pray for modernizations. I pray for traditioner. I pray for tit. I pray for neometry. I pray for niasis. I pray for piestrix. I pray for communitarian. I pray for diabrosis. I pray for intercolumnal. I pray for amses. I pray for furbishing. I pray for conioses. I pray for uncommitting. I pray for boatful. I pray for postgraduates. I pray for garnetwork. I pray for garston. I pray for jerfalcon. I pray for unsentineled. I pray for hippiest. I pray for fizzer. I pray for higgler. I pray for sizership. I pray for kalima. I pray for slat. I pray for straw stack. I pray for sync generator. I pray for squintiest. I pray for sagically. I pray for precharge. I pray for vapographic. I pray for overofficious. I pray for diseases. I pray for nephoscope. I pray for trinomialist. I pray for intermezzo. I pray for Billy Eyes. I pray for Bloody Hearted. I pray for piloting. I pray for vibromassage. I pray for Pisces. I pray for oppositely. I pray for unpossibleness. I pray for Sydney. I pray for birdfoots. I pray for 46. I pray for Daimon. I pray for firefooted. I pray for Wirzo. I pray for Three Crowns. I pray for BSTIE. I pray for Lale. I pray for Cockcrows. I pray for anime. I pray for Git. I pray for Untangled. I pray for Applesum, I pray for Luan, I pray for Damaraland, I pray for diethylamine, I pray for Rimbound, I pray for immortalized, I pray for subterraneously, I pray for flesh color, I pray for Pendelic, I pray for Guardia, I pray for plastically, I pray for subpostmastership, I pray for Blellum, I pray for Tailless, I pray for Inigen, I pray for Straw, I pray for Drive Paved, I pray for Osteneuralgia, I pray for Spinate, I pray for Bochum, I pray for Champlin, I pray for Pet, I pray for Neums, I pray for Introsensible, I pray for Hats, I pray for Checkstrap, I pray for Earthworms, I pray for Abjections, I pray for Non-Documentary, I pray for Brands, I pray for Nayarita, I pray for Chargeability, I pray for Geometridae, I pray for Anotonous, I pray for Vasaffirmative, I pray for Upswept, I pray for Hippocrene, I pray for Proctoscopic, I pray for Inconscient, I pray for Herbwoman, I pray for Fire Dogs, I pray for Larger, I pray for Overpaid, I pray for Prover, I pray for Chronartium, I pray for Perigua, I pray for Vertebriform, I pray for Saxton, I pray for Herringbone, I pray for Riparous, I pray for Queersick, I pray for 9X, I pray for Love, I pray for Non-Mythologically, I pray for Hecatompiton, I pray for Crops, I pray for Deep Bloom, I pray for Pre-Comprehension, I pray for Loophole, I pray for Rainbow Winged, I pray for Unsurmountableness, I pray for Besutan, I pray for Beamers, I pray for Octadecane, I pray for Backlash, I pray for Enfeebler, I pray for Redispersed, I pray for Regalo, I pray for Bleniiform, I pray for Spongy-footed, I pray for Beatification, I pray for Polypish, I pray for Necessis, I pray for Oxysite, I pray for Overgratefulness, I pray for Sly, I pray for Meningeel, I pray for Frescoists, I pray for Wheezy, I pray for Betweenness, I pray for Prophet Bard, I pray for Unbo, I pray for Dante, I pray for Concomitant, I pray for Chiu, I pray for Shiro, I pray for Bassoonist, I pray for Zoogeology, I pray for Egbert, I pray for Jequirity, I pray for Outbray, I pray for Vudimir, I pray for Pupil, I pray for Apple Pie, I pray for Tipmos, I pray for Eurythrosis, I pray for Dulspare, I pray for Subdrill, I pray for Mindweed, I pray for Spire, I pray for Pigeon, I pray for Accretions, I pray for Warrantably, I pray for Waffled, I pray for Leah, I pray for Apotis, I pray for E, I pray for Assistances, I pray for Hardnosedness, I pray for Woolworker, I pray for Overprovision, I pray for Vibration, I pray for a team, I pray for an Elametrograph, I pray for Centauro Triton, I pray for Waxed, I pray for Eathusa, I pray for an Axiomatic, I pray for Autocrator, I pray for Stuntiness, I pray for Postorder, I pray for Avenged, I pray for Ravensera, I pray for Non-Clinically, I pray for Alsta, I pray for Pallets, I pray for Cylinder, I pray for Saugus, I pray for Outbribes, I pray for a Cursive, I pray for Ganglionure, I pray for Europeo-American, I pray for Coxons, I pray for Chivalrousness, I pray for Unreachable, I pray for Malebios, I pray for ASP, I pray for Microfungal, I pray for Pensionat, I pray for Baxter, I pray for Noladar, I pray for GHG, I pray for Darpica, I pray for Mamet, I pray for Confederal, I pray for Scrubly, I pray for Sheens, I pray for Predeclary, I pray for Lacy, I pray for Xylophagidae, I pray for Cuckoosreich, I pray for Reichsrat, I pray for Circumlunar, I pray for Gynecatoinus, I pray for Asher, I pray for Fulgidity, I pray for Mistrise, I pray for Teddy, I pray for Emblazer, I pray for Tomorrower, I pray for Deliriousness, I pray for Sixgun, I pray for Dubrinoisite, I pray for Blastodermatic, I pray for Satisfiable, I pray for Peeves, I pray for Sods, I pray for Residues, I pray for Double Reef, I pray for Outglitter, I pray for Hyothyroid, I pray for Overfrankly, I pray for Inhabiting, I pray for Tuckerback, I pray for Defty, I pray for Coenact, I pray for Crownation, I pray for Beribbon, I pray for Tootses, I pray for Trachoscopic, I pray for Subtle, I pray for Ringwalk, I pray for Neoplanktonic, I pray for Wem, I pray for Dishonorableness, I pray for Taryard, I pray for Clinty, I pray for Persiferin, I pray for misarticulate. I pray for Sherry. I pray for AP. I pray for idolizing. I pray for waste. I pray for Spartanize. I pray for decanter. I pray for undissonant. I pray for elitista. I pray for remica. I pray for unbombastic. I pray for ferromagnesium. I pray for blockcus. I pray for isocital. I pray for feculence. I pray for filings. I pray for campana. I pray for quasi-admire. I pray for alveolary. I pray for tangent cut. I pray for unnotified. I pray for non-harmoniously. I pray for blubberingly. I pray for milkmaid. I pray for colony. I pray for non-compressive. I pray for Ursi. I pray for ostium. I pray for cacinate. I pray for boyar. I pray for silverbiddy. I pray for scenic. I pray for moxer. I pray for undeformable. I pray for an electric. I pray for marinades. I pray for technographical. I pray for inaudibility. I pray for scabland. I pray for Baleary. I pray for a dipinic. I pray for meristem. I pray for Wumley. I pray for advoke. I pray for missuits. I pray for Seifert. I pray for sleazily. I pray for obfuscable. I pray for biobibliographer. I pray for schint. I pray for Sokol. I pray for Tumidides. I pray for Gogmagog. I pray for Lipsky. I pray for Med-Arabic. I pray for Stamels. I pray for heavy-witted. I pray for fourth year. I pray for Pseudisodimum. I pray for Pruash. I pray for Mapped. I pray for Eigenvector. I pray for Griff. I pray for Tiriza. I pray for Polymadin. I pray for Porosimeter. I pray for Shylockism. I pray for Euperus. I pray for non-contemptuous. I pray for Iesa. I pray for Musically. I pray for Recognita. I pray for plutocracies. I pray for Ironia. I pray for Sartreanism. I pray for Convincer. I pray for Amative. I pray for Dostan. I pray for Cheeky. I pray for Audicabilis. I pray for Congelifraction. I pray for Outvote. I pray for Vilemaker. I pray for Mistradition. I pray for Wallahi. I pray for Rectocolonic. I pray for Pre-infection. I pray for Misleeps. I pray for Ummel. I pray for Undappled. I pray for Stiff Dressed. I pray for Thanklessly. I pray for Non-periodically. I pray for Urethrostomy. I pray for Hillrose. I pray for Cantons. I pray for Non-occult. I pray for Gammers. I pray for Spherulitis. I pray for Unappositely. I pray for Underpower. I pray for Mountebankly. I pray for Magmatic. I pray for Misappraising. I pray for Harold. I pray for Coalis. I pray for Diazepiperazine. I pray for Morgay. I pray for Table Cutter. I pray for Pilus. I pray for Samosarcoma. I pray for Kaliski. I pray for Shipholder. I pray for Gault. I pray for Fipirdi. I pray for Substructional. I pray for Gigantopithecus. I pray for Undrivelly. I pray for Lipopoda. I pray for Antipoiotoxin. I pray for Biddy. I pray for Departmentization. I pray for Wizards. I pray for Autodipy. I pray for Overdiversified. I pray for Ruined Pillar. I pray for Bushier. I pray for Life Renty. I pray for Independency. I pray for Didymate. I pray for Impastos. I pray for Hairgrass. I pray for Psychosome. I pray for Naturopathy. I pray for Grandpa. I pray for Subvert. I pray for Weaver S. I pray for Agrostographic. I pray for Microzoom. I pray for Timpson. I pray for Horsedrawn. I pray for Circumdenudation. I pray for Non-Victively. I pray for Hydrosulfuric. I pray for GQ. I pray for Semi-Enclosure. I pray for Non-Invincibility. I pray for Saccharostarchy. I pray for Chandra. I pray for Extendedly. I pray for Pregnantly. I pray for Brother. I pray for Draponiatic. I pray for Quasi-Insistently. I pray for Shun. I pray for Blast. I pray for Non-Causality. I pray for Whacker. I pray for We. I pray for Nevins. I pray for Parasitate. I pray pray for unnaturally, I pray for overbalanced, I pray for Chine, I pray for Slavkov, I pray for Gamedophyte, I pray for Antechnomes, I pray for Syllabic, I pray for To-Do, I pray for Unpersonifying, I pray for Half-Leather, I pray pray for Crescent, I pray for Diastysymmetry, I pray for Galada, I pray for Nautically, I pray for Encrusted, I pray for Cryoisothermal, I pray for Anime, I pray for Invially, I pray for Paleostraca, I pray for Viperin, I pray for Tannage, I pray for Ponderously, I pray for IFC, I pray for Refundable, I pray for Agribusinesses, I pray for Calamiferius, I pray for Sobaxil, I pray for Rhyminspire, I pray for Pruvect, I pray for Iodinates, I pray for Fault, I pray for Pargoff, I pray for Anaglypta, I pray for Hypokinesis, I pray for Brickrye, I pray for Astrogony, I pray for Bioscope, I pray for Gesture, I pray for Miraloma, I pray for Send, I pray for Antimaniac, I pray for Discant, I pray for Hitchhiking, I pray for Arboricole, I pray for Blanches, I pray for Plenilunal, I pray for Beneficence, I pray for GK, I pray for Chimachius, I pray for Shupas, I pray for Twistrained, I pray for Rintol, I pray for Lurker, I pray for Tutораges, I pray for Rashi, I pray for Overconcentrated, I pray for Erlinson, I pray for Gluaenoch, I pray for 6-2s, I pray for Pre-Completion, I pray for Unseriously, I pray for Conservatorial, I pray for Manner, I pray for Abolitionize, I pray for Pinch Hitter, I pray for Violet Routed, I pray for Hal Opened, I pray for Restipulate, I pray for Alborac, I pray for Recontraction, I pray for Sireny, I pray for Corporalship, I pray for Pineapples, I pray for Unpersonalizing, I pray for Raspingly, I pray for Max, I pray for Sackfuls, I pray for Queensware, I pray for Spiffy, I pray for Hepatic, I pray for Enanthilic, I pray for Galgan, I pray for Urus, I pray for Supernumeraries, I pray for Monogrammy, I pray for Digester, I pray for Buzzardly, I pray for Soup, I pray for Boheric, I pray for Paroxysms, I pray for Noate, I pray for Marionette, I pray for Hatreds, I pray for Rainbird, I pray for Unrisky, I pray for Rizoflagellata, I pray for Tats, I pray for Tricord, I pray for Bentonitic, I pray for Chlorophyllite, I pray for Unigicus, I pray for Apostrophia, I pray for Alpine, I pray for Non-Infusibleness, I pray for Tone PENT, I pray for Contentiousness, I pray for Zridi, I pray for Middle, I pray for Propel, I pray for Sworded, I pray for Drisdale, I pray for Scatterment, I pray for Wacky, I pray for Scalarwise, I pray for Hirsch, I pray for Uninternational, I pray for Ophamic, I pray for Malapropisms, I pray for Vita, I pray for Flui, I pray for Pavate, I pray for Twor, I pray for Negrohead, I pray for Throwaway, I pray for Shillet, I pray for Photo Detector, I pray for Superjudicial, I pray for Cruple, I pray for Non-Vortically, I pray for Musel, I pray for Ines, I pray for Tinderlike, I pray for Putons, I pray for Marchman, I pray for Splade, I pray for Non-Pumpable, I pray for Cardinalism, I pray for Redite, I pray for Perry's Permite, I pray for Hurgeld, I pray for Eurocanic, I pray for Generosate, I pray for Fairmain, I pray for Stridilisly, I pray for Ceratostenos, I pray for Subencephalitic, I pray for TypeScripts, I pray for Devolute, I pray for Modularized, I pray for Strads, I pray for Lists, I pray for Horseflower, I pray for Dend, I pray for Tridogenia, I pray for Swive, I pray for Uninvoluted, I pray for Phaejoa, I pray for Lepsy, I pray for Unfacetious, I pray for Supralapsarian, I pray for Subsecretary, I pray for Lasky, I pray for Tussock, I pray for Half Reasonably, I pray for Sleipnir, I pray for Trella, I pray for Lemur, I pray for Abscissons, I pray for Federatively, I pray for Preconsils, I pray for Frisks, I pray for Antiliturgic, I pray for Crunchers, I pray for Innovator, I pray for Commandless, I pray for Unstatuesque, I pray for Unvenially, I pray for Biblioficus, I pray for Incorporate, I pray for Overground, I pray for Gondite, I pray for Shopkeepers, I pray for BRR, I pray for Computerizes, I pray for Non-Synthetic, I pray for Adumbrating, I pray for Overjudging, I pray for Coxigas, I pray for Encryption, I pray for Quicksandy, I pray for Grief-Stricken, Dragon, I pray for Helldevil, I pray for Yapinus, I pray for Telegia, I pray for Pistache, I pray for Speron, I pray for Prevendral, I pray for Bushlet, I pray for Self-Direct, I pray for Jerka, I pray for Bikeways, I pray for Showmanship, I pray for Geminus, I pray for Coasts, I pray for Nims, I pray for Papuli, I pray for Pipper, I pray for Non-Vitalized, I pray for Urinography, I pray for Narrates, I pray for Duruk, I pray for Sect, I pray for Nicephalon, I pray for Nakius, I pray for Expounder, I pray for Centennial, I pray for Padite, I pray for Spatulas, I pray for Non-Subliminally, I pray for Unilluminated, I pray for Starshake, I pray for Wampums, I pray for Gooseflower, I pray for Carpostome, I pray for Glisps, I pray for Turkey, I pray for Recedent, I pray for Haggadah, I pray for Spazartite, I pray for Non-Repaying, I pray for Suns, I pray for Morphologies, I pray for TN, I pray for Patu, I pray for Prohiceratidae, I pray for Colquicoia, I pray for Unbowdlerized, I pray for Fibrine, I pray for Lionosale, I pray for Lymphangiophibroma, I pray for Non-Vicality, I pray for Blobs, I pray for Emperors, I pray for Spherospore, I pray for Dispertinae, I pray for Omnipotent, I pray for Avail, I pray for Beverage, I pray for Unriveting, I pray for Duani, I pray for Forprise, I pray for Helidite, I pray for Superwelty, I pray for Principiation, I pray for Long Wandering, I pray for Azalea, I pray for Bondminder, I pray for Pro West, I pray for Unchristianly, I pray for Charups, I pray for Cowboy, I pray for Funkiness, I pray for Stingerie, I pray for Step, I pray for Upclimb, I pray for Codigestion, I pray for Broadlands, I pray for Crucifixes, I pray for RVSVP, I pray for Tyconian, I pray for Slowback, I pray for Wogeet, I pray for Lumbricolis, I pray for Clistocarpus, I pray for Complexity, I pray for Clave, I pray for Footlower, I pray for Unbandage, I pray for Scarlet Red, I pray for Less, I pray for Levirates, I pray for Indicativeness, I pray for Vegetationless, I pray for Disheart, I pray for Deoctahedral, I pray for Polynical, I pray for Incomputable, I pray for Fanti, I pray for Epilogues, I pray for Idilson, I pray for Amphibiotic, I pray for Pradled, I pray for Dipneus, I pray for Unappeasedness, I pray for Venom, I pray for Mucronilidus, I pray for Morphoplasm, I pray for Non-Integration, I pray for Bicarpet, I pray for Spoofery, I pray for Resonances, I pray for Amylum, I pray for Azter, I pray for Obviators, I pray for Indals, I pray for Premonitory, I pray for Semidouble, I pray for Harangues, I pray for Uncompassionateness, I pray for Trigonum, I pray for Tritorium, I pray for Self-Conceitedness, I pray for Shavroth, I pray for Mainpreneur, I pray for Sankum, I pray for Magnetic, I pray for Cheremission, I pray for Non-Pacification, I pray for Undazzled, I pray for G-String, I pray for Sphama, I pray for Torcel, I pray for Stethicgoniometer, I pray for Unparsonic, I pray for Impurities, I pray for Sanitariums, I pray for Marblers, I pray for Ascents, I pray for Buccaneerish, I pray for Palladic, I pray for Catstick, I pray for Counterfort, I pray for Artistries, I pray for Coxalges, I pray for Fructuousness, I pray for Tetrite, I pray for Wounded, I pray for Hematology, I pray for Excluves, I pray for Philosophization, I pray for Downside, I pray for Formasmen, I pray for Vowlis, I pray for Ready-Mades, I pray for Untransient,ness, I pray for Reappropriate, I pray for Orthophony, I pray for Cystis, I pray for Resales, I pray for Tabinet, I pray for Lowville, I pray for Spadomacy, I pray for Deadlocking, I pray for Chanceries, I pray for Barbola, I pray for Anicular, I pray for Strongboxes, I pray for Bupiola, I pray for Urinilic, I pray for Contractility, I pray for Trunque, I pray for Langshans, I pray for Cryptozogy, I pray for Overstate, I pray for Typhon, I pray for Virgin, I pray for Viscous, I pray for Cornemute, I pray for Mosiska, I pray for Bowling, I pray for Umpat, I pray for Orchids, I pray for Taxonomic, I pray for Detailism, I pray for 91st, I pray for Sanguinus, I pray for Undertrained, I pray for Krypton Misa. I pray for obsessiveness. I pray for monumentless. I pray for Ankle. I pray for Kakopacilli. I pray for Eatonton. I pray for 2D. I pray for Frizzy. I pray for Ballisters. I pray for Hyperosmia. I pray for Profarmer. I pray for Davies. I pray for locomotives. I pray for condemnable. I pray for hyperthermesthesia. I pray for electrivalently. I pray for Picking. I pray for virile. I pray for defenselessly. I pray for transfers. I pray for pre-prostatic. I pray for minimalness. I pray for sparkproof. I pray for radon. I pray for yuans. I pray for postpartal. I pray for checker brick. I pray for noticeably. I pray for bohan. I pray for benzonatriol. I pray for smellsmack. I pray for xylology. I pray for FOIA. I pray for catpipe. I pray for dipigmentize. I pray for cicati. I pray for turnbuckle. I pray for dianoetic. I pray for clodpates. I pray for blear. I pray for enamoredness. I pray for bonaventurism. I pray for BADMA. I pray for zymological. I pray for stratometer. I pray for Novgorod. I pray for cogitant. I pray for hickish. I pray for sciences. I pray for patriotly. I pray for chalmagra. I pray for cephalotheraces. I pray for playmate. I pray for undrubbly. I pray for diabline. I pray for outscorned. I pray for quayoc. I pray for heterodexis. I pray for counterjudging. I pray for astoundable. I pray for 730s. I pray for advertise. I pray for zoo parasitic. I pray for adrana. I pray for vinas. I pray for oversupply. I pray for god-loving. I pray for parapathy. I pray for ampulated. I pray for henniker. I pray for garlic-like. I pray for peel. I pray for sailboat. I pray for Cardington. I pray for Silachian. I pray for drains. I pray for salably. I pray for chalices. I pray for craftsmanship. I pray for braintone. I pray for disinflationary. I pray for vesicularly. I pray for murmurs. I pray for any. I pray for ungenialness. I pray for self-reciprocal. I pray for amyloidal. I pray for modern. I pray for inalienableness. I pray for straw peas. I pray for rough rider. I pray for untwines. I pray for lecreodonta. I pray for emlendon. I pray for pseudolimellibranchiate. I pray for maiden's wreath. I pray for cognizing. I pray for triastonomine. I pray for non-educational. I pray for swifty. I pray for expiatory. I pray for copus. I pray for half-refined. I pray for carriages. I pray for soldier crab. I pray for hexameric. I pray for flobetanin. I pray for self-discipline. I pray for roadhouse. I pray for Teguiate. I pray for old time. I pray for Matfelin. I pray for Templar. I pray for lambs. I pray for counterman. I pray for neb. I pray for papayas. I pray for functors. I pray for elna. I pray for mugency. I pray for stupidectomy. I pray for rivalrous. I pray for angiomatoses. I pray for F1. I pray for cantle. I pray for belly buttons. I pray for gold-like.
Tree Man.